Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. We tell them not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a case that changed the way authorities in the United Kingdom approach stalking and domestic abuse. This is the story of Alice Ruggles, a vibrant young woman whose life was cut tragically short, and whose legacy continues to save lives today. Alice Ruggles was born on Christmas Eve, 1991, in the quiet Leicestershire village of Langton, England. She was the third of 4 children born to Sue Hills and Clive Ruggles. Sandwiched between her sister Emma and her brothers Nick and Patrick, the Ruggles household was close-knit, filled with laughter, practical jokes, and the kind of warm chaos that comes with raising 4 bright, energetic children. From an early age, Alice had a gift for making people smile. She was quick-witted, mischievous, and possessed an infectious sense of humor that could lift the spirits of anyone around her. Her teachers at Leicester High School for Girls remembered her as someone who saw the fun side of everything, who could turn an ordinary moment into something memorable with just a comment or a well-timed joke. Alice had a natural empathy that drew people to her. She was the kind of friend who really listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what others were saying, feeling what they felt. This quality would stay with her throughout her life, making her beloved by friends, family, and eventually colleagues. As she grew older, Alice developed a fascination with design and engineering. She enrolled at Northumbria University to study product design engineering. Drawn by their excellent program and perhaps by the university's fencing team, Alice had always been athletic and adventurous, someone who threw herself wholeheartedly into new experiences. After graduating in 2014, Alice secured a position at Sky, the media giant, working at their Newcastle hub. She was good at her job, so good that by 2016 she'd been promoted to site coordinator. Her colleagues remember her sharp sense of humor, her work ethic, and the positive energy she brought to the office every day. By October 2016, Alice was 24 years old. She was living in Gateshead with her flatmate and work colleague, Maxine McGill, in a ground-floor apartment on Rawling Road. She had her whole life ahead of her, a promising career, close friendships, a loving family, and plans for the future. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but there was a shadow in Alice's life, one that had been growing darker for months. His name was Tremont Dillon, though Alice knew him as Harry. It began, as so many relationships do these days, online. In October 2015, Alice was scrolling through Facebook when she received a message from someone named Harry Dillon. He'd seen a photograph of her that a mutual friend had posted. He told her she was the most naturally beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Lance Corporal Tremont Dillon, who went by the name Harry, was serving with the 2 Scots Regiment stationed in Afghanistan in a non-combat role. Born in India, he'd moved to England for university and eventually enlisted in the British Army. He was training with the elite Special Reconnaissance Regiment. Ambitious and driven, with aspirations of advancing his military career, the two began messaging regularly. Harry would send Alice flowers with sweet notes attached. Alice, touched by the gesture, would send care packages to Afghanistan. It was a romance conducted primarily through screens and messages, the kind where you can present your best self, where misunderstandings can be smoothed over with the right emoji, where red flags can be harder to spot. In January 2016, Harry returned to the UK briefly before heading back to Afghanistan. They met in person for the first time, spending time together in Newcastle and Edinburgh. The chemistry seemed real. By early 2016, when Harry returned from Afghanistan for good and was stationed at Penicuik, south of Edinburgh, they were officially a couple. But something changed once Harry was back permanently. The sweet messages and thoughtful gestures began to take on a different tone. He would call Alice constantly, expecting her to always be available. If she didn't answer immediately, he'd want to know why. He made snide comments about her appearance, little digs that seemed designed to chip away at her confidence rather than build it up. When Alice went out with friends, Harry would show up unexpectedly. He'd persuade her to leave with him instead, slowly isolating her from the people who knew and loved her. He was critical of her life, her choices, her appearance. He even took control of her Facebook account. Alice's family noticed the change in her. During a family holiday to Cornwall in July 2016, they saw how withdrawn and unhappy she'd become. The vibrant, confident young woman they knew had become quiet, almost timid. She'd lost weight. She'd fallen out with her housemates and moved to a new flat. The endless banter on the family WhatsApp group, which had once been full of Alice's jokes and observations, had grown quieter. There was something else strange that happened with that WhatsApp group. Back in October 2015, shortly after Alice had first connected with Harry, her messages to the family group stopped appearing. Then her account seemed to leave the group entirely. At the time, the family joked about it, calling Alice a ghost. But looking back, it raises a chilling question. Had Harry been interfering with her accounts even then, monitoring her communications from the very beginning? In summer 2016, Alice discovered that Harry had been contacting other women on social media and dating apps. She finally ended the relationship in August. She thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong. Harry Dillon wasn't ready to let Alice go. In his mind, their story wasn't over. It would never be over. The messages started almost immediately. Text after text, email after email, voicemail after voicemail. Sometimes the messages came from Harry's number. Sometimes they came from numbers Alice didn't recognize. The content varied. Sometimes pleading, sometimes apologetic, sometimes threatening. He wrote her letters telling her he was going to marry her, that she'd have to deal with him for the rest of her life. He composed poems, one including the line that he could not accept it had ended. In one text message, Harry told Alice he would cut his arm off to be with her, that he'd write her a letter in his own blood. In another message, he threatened to kill himself if she didn't take him back. But Harry didn't just stalk Alice digitally. He began showing up at her flat unannounced. Alice would hear knocking on her door late at night. But when she looked through the peephole or out the window, no one would be there. He was playing a game, testing her, letting her know he could reach her whenever he wanted. Alice had started seeing someone new, a man named Mike. Harry somehow knew about this. He tried to interfere with the new relationship, contacting Mike, creating problems. Alice's father, Clive, would later say that Harry seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know unless he was monitoring their private conversations. Harry had installed spyware on Alice's phone and had access to her Facebook account, allowing him to track her movements and read her messages. On the night of September 30th, 2016, Harry drove from his barracks in Edinburgh to Gateshead, a round trip of about 20-40 miles. He arrived at Alice's flat and knocked on her door 3 times, slipping away into the darkness each time she came to look. Then he went around to the back and knocked on her bedroom window as she lay in bed. Finally, he left flowers and chocolates on the window ledge before driving away. As Harry drove back to Edinburgh that night, he left Alice voice messages. In one chilling recording, he said, "I've never hurt you. I don't want to kill you." The very fact that he felt the need to say such a thing was telling. He was putting the idea into the air, perhaps testing how it felt to say those words aloud. That night, terrified and exhausted, Alice finally called the police. It was 12:33 a.m. on Saturday, October 1, 2016. Alice dialed 101, the non-emergency number for Northumbria Police. In the recording of that call, which is now in the public domain, you can hear Alice's voice, calm, polite, almost apologetic for bothering them. She explained what had been happening, the constant messages, the unwanted visits, the flowers left on her window in the middle of the night. The officer who took the call was sympathetic and reassuring. He explained Alice's options. She could go to a solicitor and take out an injunction, or the police could issue a police information notice, a PIN, which means if he ever comes near you again, or contacts you again, he'll be arrested. The officer said, "So which would you prefer?" "Can I try that option, please?" Alice replied. The PIN was issued. The warning was communicated to Harry Dillon at his barracks in Edinburgh by his army superiors on October 3. Colleagues, Friends and even his doctor had also told him to leave Alice alone. A Northumbria police officer had contacted Harry's barracks and spoken to his superior, but critically, not to the military police or Police Scotland. Alice felt protected. She felt heard. She believed the authorities would keep her safe. She didn't know that a pin carries no legal weight. It's essentially a warning, nothing more. They're no longer used in stalking cases, but in 2016 they were still standard procedure. For a few days, things were quiet. Alice began to relax, to feel like herself again. But on October 7, just 5 days after the pin was issued, Alice received a package. Inside was a letter from Harry, along with photos and a notebook. He was still contacting her, still ignoring the warnings from the police and his commanding officers. Alice called the police again. This time the response was different, less sympathetic. The call wasn't recorded as being linked to her previous report. The system had failed to connect the dots. No action was taken. Alice was devastated. She sent a message to her sister Emma. "They will respond when he has stabbed me." 2 days before Alice died, on October 10, she spoke to her mother on the phone. "Mum," Alice said, "I think he's gonna kill me. Sue Hills." Alice's mother would later recall that conversation with unbearable clarity. At the time, she tried to reassure her daughter. "Things like that don't really happen," she told Alice, "but they do happen. They happen far too often." Wednesday, October 12, 2016, started like any other day for Alice Ruggles. She went to work at Sky, chatted with colleagues, did her job. Her new boyfriend Mike was planning to visit her the next day. She had a formal event coming up and needed to choose a dress. Life was moving forward, despite the dark cloud of Harry's obsession. At 4:13 that afternoon, Harry Dillon parked his white BMW near Alice's flat on Rawling Road. He'd driven the 20 miles from Edinburgh yet again. He settled in to wait. At 5:38 p.m., Alice's boss dropped her off at home after work. Alice went inside, locked the door, and began going about her evening. She texted friends, excited about Mike's upcoming visit. She was trying on ball gowns for the formal event, sending pictures to friends, and to Mike for their opinions on which dress looked best. At 6:04 p.m., she sent her last messages. Outside, Harry was still waiting in his car. While he sat there, he messaged a woman in Durham, arranging to meet up with her later that evening. Was he trying to create an alibi to establish that he had other plans, other interests? With his plans for later confirmed, Harry climbed out of his car. He went around to the back of Alice's flat, scaled the wall into the rear yard, and forced his way in through a window. What happened next? Only Harry knows for certain, but the evidence painted a clear picture. Alice must have heard him. She retreated to the bathroom, trying to lock herself in, a desperate attempt to create a barrier between herself and the man who had been terrorizing her for months. But Harry kicked down the bathroom door. According to forensic analysis, Alice was likely standing with her back to the door when Harry attacked her from behind. He forced her into the shower, shoved her to the floor, and jammed his knee into her back. Then he grabbed her hair and, with a carving knife, slashed her throat. He didn't stop with one cut. He slashed at her neck 6 times, cutting through her voice box and her right carotid artery. The pathologist who later examined Alice's body, Dr. Jennifer Bolton, found that the cuts went so deep they reached her spine. Alice sustained 24 injuries in total, including defensive wounds on her hands, where she tried desperately to protect herself. Dr. Bolton would testify in court that Alice's injuries were unsurvivable. She died from catastrophic blood loss there on the bathroom floor in her own home, in the place where she should have been safe. The last time Alice's phone was used was at 6:01 p.m., when she sent a WhatsApp message to a friend. CCTV footage shows Harry's car leaving the area at 6:25 p.m. 9 minutes after that, at 6:34 p.m., Maxine McGill called 999. Maxine had been planning to go to her boyfriend's house in Durham after work. She'd stopped by the flat briefly to pick up her mobile phone. When she arrived, she found the door locked. She knocked, called out for Alice, but got no response. Concerned, Maxine went around to the back and climbed in through a window, the same window Harry had used to break in. Looking for her phone, she glanced toward the bathroom. The scene that greeted her was something no one should ever have to see. Alice was lying on the bathroom floor, in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed. From the sheer volume of blood, from the unnatural stillness of her friend's body, Maxine knew immediately that Alice was dead. She called 999, her voice hysterical with shock and grief. On the recording, you can hear her trying to make sense of what she's seeing. "She's covered in blood," she cries. "Her leg looks broken. She's blue." And then, even in her panic, Maxine knew. She told the operator about Harry Dillon, about how he'd been stalking Alice, threatening her. She called him an absolute psychopath. When first responders arrived, they confirmed what Maxine already knew. The wound to Alice's neck was catastrophic. There was nothing anyone could have done to save her. Detective Chief Inspector Lisa Thieker was called into work at 7:45 p.m. As she drove to meet her team, she was briefed on the basics. A young woman found dead in her flat, throat slashed, her flatmate hysterical. Her name was Alice Ruggles. There was tension between her and an ex-boyfriend. Desai Thieker's mind raced. In murder investigations, they call it the golden hour. That crucial first 60 minutes when evidence is fresh, when memories are clearest, when the perpetrator might still be covered in forensic evidence. Every decision made in that hour can mean the difference between justice and impunity. "Where's my offender?" Thieker thought. That's the real priority, because there will be a wealth of forensic evidence on them. She ordered her team to seize Maxine's clothing, along with that of Alice's boss, who'd given her a lift home. She needed to corroborate his story, eliminate him as a suspect. She learned about the ex-boyfriend, Lance Corporal Tremont Dillon, based at barracks in Edinburgh. She asked for his car registration to be run through the automatic number plate recognition system. The ANPR came back quickly. Harry's car had been spotted in the area, near Alice's flat. They had him. By 8:20 p.m., the homicide squad was assembled in the incident room, receiving their briefing. The clock was ticking. They needed to find Harry Dillon before he had a chance to clean himself up, dispose of evidence, construct an alibi. At 3 a.m., when Harry was due to be released from custody, he'd been brought in for questioning. DCI Thieker convinced her superintendent to grant a 12-hour extension. She had a hunch, and she needed more time to confirm it. The breakthrough came from Alice's phone records. They showed that Alice last used her phone at 6:01 p.m. CCTV footage showed Harry's car leaving the area at 6:25 p.m. But here was the crucial detail. Data from telecommunications masts showed that Alice's phone connected with a mast near Newcastle Airport at 6:39 p.m. Along the route, Harry claimed to have taken home after what he called a confrontation with Alice. Harry had taken Alice's phone, and that lie, that provable, traceable lie, was enough. When officers tracked Harry down at his barracks in Edinburgh, in the early hours of October 13, he was attempting to climb out over the wall, trying to leave. He initially denied any knowledge of Alice's murder, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic evidence placing him at the scene. Alice's phone in his possession, CCTV footage. His car's movements tracked by ANPR. He was arrested for the murder of Alice Ruggles. The trial began on April 10, 2017, at Newcastle Crown Court. Over the course of 2 weeks, prosecutors laid out the case against Tremont Dillon. They detailed his controlling behavior during the relationship, the escalating stalking after Alice ended things. They ignored warnings from police and his military superiors. Harry's defense was shocking in its audacity. He denied murder. He claimed that Alice had attacked him with the carving knife after an argument, that he'd put her in a headlock to defend himself, and that she'd somehow collapsed in the bathroom. He said she'd lunged at him, lost her balance, hit her head on the sink, and pushed the knife into her own throat. It was an absurd story, and Dr. Jennifer Bolton, the pathologist, testified that Harry's account was completely inconsistent with Alice's injuries. The forensic evidence showed that Alice had been attacked from behind, that the wounds were inflicted by someone standing over her, that the cuts were deliberate and forceful. The jury saw through Harry's lies. They saw his lack of remorse, his arrogance, his calculated attempts to manipulate the narrative. In court, Harry showed no emotion. He'd been so focused on constructing his story, on getting the details right, that he'd forgotten even to shed what Judge Paul Sloan would later call a crocodile tear. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty of murder. On April 26, 2017, Judge Paul Sloan sentenced Tremont Dillon to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge said, Not a shred of remorse have you shown from first to last. Indeed, you were concentrating so hard on getting your story right when giving evidence. You forgot even to shed a crocodile tear. You went to her flat, she was alone that night, and what you did will have terrified her. This was an act of utter barbarism. Harry Dillon, who had once aspired to join the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, who had presented himself as a devoted boyfriend, was revealed for what he truly was, a controlling, manipulative, dangerous stalker who had taken an innocent life. In the aftermath of Alice's death, a domestic homicide review was conducted by Gateshead Council. The review made 20 recommendations for local authorities, the Home Office, and the Ministry of Defense, an attempt to ensure that the systemic failures that had left Alice vulnerable would not claim another victim. The failures were numerous and heartbreaking. When Alice first contacted the police, she told them she was being stalked. She provided ample evidence. But the police information notice that was issued carried no legal weight. When she called again 5 days later to report that Harry was still harassing her, the call wasn't even recorded as linked to her previous report. The military police were never contacted. Police Scotland was never informed. The dots that should have been connected remained scattered. Most devastatingly, Harry Dillon had a history of this behavior. Before Alice, there was a woman named Aniko Nemaith, who had been his fiancée. In June 2013, after Nemaith had ended their engagement, Harry approached her and her new boyfriend on the street. He spat in her face and called her a derogatory name. Nemaith filed a restraining order against him. After Alice's death, statements from 3 other women emerged, detailing similar patterns of stalking and harassment by Harry. One case from the south of England showed striking similarities to Alice's experience. If Alice had known about Harry's violent past, her family believes she never would have entered into a relationship with him. If the police and military had taken her report seriously, had connected the information they had recognized Harry as a serial stalker, Alice might still be alive. We believe that her death was preventable, Alice's parents, Sue and Clive, said. We find it difficult to comprehend that, although Alice described in her first phone call to the police that she was being stalked and provided ample evidence, the police and the army were unable to support and protect her. Alice's sister, Emma Ruggles, herself a serving soldier, expressed her frustration with the army's response to the murder. She had no contact from Harry's unit, received no response to questions she posed to the Royal Military Police, and felt no sense that lessons had been learned. Similar situations need to be taken far more seriously in the future by both the police and the army, Emma said. Failure to do so would show a blatant lack of regard for my sister, the nightmare she lived in her last few months, and the sustained, painful, violent last few minutes of her life. But Alice's family didn't let their grief paralyze them. Instead, they channeled it into action. They established the Alice Ruggles Trust, a registered charity dedicated to raising awareness of stalking and coercive control, advocating for effective legislation, and bringing about lasting improvements in the management of perpetrators and the protection of victims. The trust became a member of the National Stalking Consortium. They developed lesson plans and resources in partnership with the PSHE Association for use with secondary school students throughout the UK, teaching young people about unhealthy relationship behaviors and stalking. These resources are now being delivered by police community support teams from at least 10 different forces around England and Wales. The Trust has been involved in training for police forces, policymakers, and other organizations. They've worked to ensure that police information notices are no longer used in stalking cases, that stalking reports are properly linked and tracked, that victims are taken seriously when they come forward. They campaigned for dedicated funding for independent stalking advocacy caseworkers, ISACs, who support, advise, and speak up for stalking victims. The intervention of an ISAC could have made a critical difference in Alice's case. Yet according to government figures, only £52,000 was provided for stalking advocates during 2020-2021, compared to more substantial sums for rape and domestic abuse victims. When compared with an estimated 1.5 million victims of stalking, this equates to just 17 pence per victim. The Alice Ruggles Trust also supports the campaign for a stalkers register in the United Kingdom, similar to sex offender registries. Under the proposed system, women would be notified if their partners had histories of violent or predatory behavior. Police would track and monitor individuals convicted of domestic abuse or stalking who have been identified as serial perpetrators with multiple unconnected victims. The Trust's work has already led to real change. There's been a marked increase in the volume of recorded stalking offenses at a local level. At a parliamentary level, there has been significant action to strengthen stalking legislation and protection for victims. Alice's mother, Dr. Sue Hills, has spoken publicly about the importance of recognizing stalking behavior. 2 days before Alice died, my daughter said to me, "Mom, I think he's going to kill me." And I just thought, this doesn't happen, but it does happen. And when we look back at some of the things that he said and did and told Alice to do, those are just classic signs of stalking. Every time we wake up in the morning, Sue said, there's a few seconds where everything seems normal, and then suddenly you think, oh, Alice is dead, and it's really hard. I don't think there's been a day since Alice died that I haven't cried. Alice Ruggles was 24 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was kind, clever, and beautiful, with an infectious personality and an incredible sense of humor. She saw the fun side of everything. She loved life, loved her friends, and loved her job. She was a brilliant listener, genuinely empathetic, quick-witted. She had the ability to cheer anyone up when they were down. Her colleagues remember her for her wit and sharp sense of humor, the positive energy she brought to the workplace. Her friends remember her loyalty, her laughter, her warmth. Her family remembers the endless banter on their WhatsApp group, her mischievous pranks, her jokes, her presence. They want her to be remembered for her bubbly energy and lust for life, not as a murder victim, but they also want her death to mean something. They want the lessons learned from her case to save other lives. They want people to recognize the warning signs of stalking and coercive control. They want victims to know they're not alone, that help is available, that they should trust their instincts when something feels wrong. According to research, in 94% of femicide cases analyzed over a 3-year period, the killer displayed the obsessive, fixated behaviors associated with stalking. 78% of stalking victims report symptoms consistent with PTSD. Statistics show that nearly 1 million women and over 500,000 men are victims of stalking in the UK each year. When warned by police, around 50% of stalkers will immediately stop the behavior. But the ones who don't stop, like Harry Dillon, can be extremely dangerous. Stalking in these cases is murder in slow motion. If you or someone you know is experiencing stalking or domestic abuse, please reach out for help. In the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service or the National Stalking Helpline. In the United States, you can contact the Stalking Resource Center at the National Center for Victims of Crime. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Tell someone, don't wait for it to get worse. Alice Ruggles should still be here. She should be living her life, pursuing her career, spending time with friends and family, making people laugh. Instead, she became a statistic, a cautionary tale, a victim of a system that failed to protect her. But through the work of the Alice Ruggles Trust, through the changes in policy and practice that her family has fought for, through the increased awareness and education around stalking and coercive control, Alice's legacy lives on. Her death was not in vain. The lessons learned from her case are saving lives today. Rest in peace, Alice. Your light continues to shine. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Let me tell you a story tonight. A story about a woman who believed in second chances, who gave her whole heart to teaching children, and who traveled across state lines one March weekend in 2014, never knowing it would be the last journey she'd ever take. This is the story of Emily Lambert. Emily Rebecca Lambert grew up in the suburbs of Dallas, in the Hurst-Euless-Bedford area, where the Texas sky stretches wide and the communities are tight-knit. From a young age, Emily faced challenges that would have discouraged many. She had a learning disability, something that made school harder for her than for other children. But Emily possessed something that couldn't be measured on any test. A fierce determination and an unwavering belief that she could overcome anything. Her parents, Stephen and Donna Koenig, watched their daughter struggle through her education. What should have taken 4 years took 10. But Emily never gave up. She chipped away at her degree, semester by semester, year after year, attending the University of North Texas. And when she finally graduated, she held that diploma like it was made of gold, because to her it was. It represented every late night of studying, every setback she'd overcome, every moment she'd refused to quit. Her mother Donna would later say, with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, "It took her a long time, but she finally finished after 10 years. She was so proud." Emily didn't just want a degree, she wanted to give back. She wanted to teach, and not just teach, but specifically teach children who struggled like she had. Children who needed someone who understood what it felt like to work twice as hard, just to keep up, someone who saw their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. In the fall of 2013, Emily began her first year as a teacher at O'Ken Henry Elementary School in the Richardson Independent School District, just north of the Lake Highlands area. She taught third-grade students, focusing on math and science. Her colleagues described her as nurturing, devoted, energetic. Her students adored her. Parents told stories of how their children would come home excited about school for the first time, all because of Os Lambert. But Emily's life held more than just her career. She was a mother to 2 young daughters, Eden and Danica. Being a mother was the role she cherished most. Her ex-husband, Donovan Lambert, would later speak about her with unmistakable affection. They had divorced in October of 2013, but theirs was an unusual post-divorce relationship. They remained friends. More than friends, they remained a team, united in their love for their daughters. They lived just down the street from each other in Louisville, deliberately choosing to stay close so their girls could easily go between homes. So neither parent would miss a moment. So Eden and Danica would always know they were surrounded by love, even if that love no longer included their parents being together. Those who knew Emily described her in terms that painted a picture of warmth. Her parents called her a social butterfly. Her ex-husband would say, his voice breaking, she was a one-of-a-kind person. She was absolutely special. There was no one like her in the world. And she was ready for love again. Ready to open her heart to someone new. In December of 2013, Emily met Robert Glenn Early. He was 33 years old from Euless, Texas. And like Emily, he was a single parent. Perhaps that's what drew them together initially. The understanding of what it meant to balance love and dating with the responsibilities of raising children. Perhaps they saw in each other the possibility of building something, of creating a blended family, of finding companionship in the midst of their busy, child-centered lives. Robert worked in the oil fields of southeastern New Mexico in Carlsbad, a small city where the Pecos River flows and the Chihuahuan desert landscape stretches in every direction. It was demanding work, the kind that kept him away from home for stretches of time. Emily remained in Texas with her daughters and her teaching job. Theirs became a long-distance relationship, sustained by phone calls and texts and occasional visits. By early 2014, they had been dating for only a few months. Their relationship was still new, still in that early phase where you're discovering who someone really is beneath the surface they show the world. In hindsight, there were things Emily didn't yet know about Robert Early. Things that simmered beneath his surface, waiting. In late February, as Emily's school approached spring break, they made plans. Emily would drive to Carlsbad to visit Robert. They'd spend the weekend together, sightseeing, exploring the area, enjoying each other's company away from the demands of their separate lives. On Friday, February 28, 2014, Emily dropped off Eden and Danica with her parents in Bedford. Stephen and Donna Koenig hugged their daughter goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time they'd ever hold her. Emily seemed happy, excited even. She was looking forward to the trip, to seeing Robert, to having a few days of adult time and romance. She made the 6-hour drive west from the Dallas suburbs into New Mexico, crossing from the green of Texas into the more arid landscape of the Land of Enchantment. Carlsbad sits in Eddy County in the southeastern corner of the state, known more for its caverns and potash mines than as a romantic getaway destination. But for Emily, it didn't matter where they were. She just wanted to spend time with the man she was falling for. She checked into the Stevens Inn, a Best Western in Carlsbad, where Robert had reserved a room for them. The hotel sat along South Canal Street, a modest but comfortable place with a swimming pool and a bar attached. The Blue Cactus Lounge, a local spot where oil workers and travelers mingled over drinks and conversation. That first day together went well. Emily called her parents. She sounded happy. They would later remember. She told them about the sightseeing they'd done, the places Robert had shown her. Everything seemed fine. Everything seemed normal, the kind of nice, unremarkable day that you don't realize you should treasure. Saturday, March 1st, dawned bright in Carlsbad. Emily and Robert spent the day together, shopping, eating out, exploring more of the area. As evening approached, they decided to stay in and have a casual night. They went down to the Blue Cactus Lounge, the hotel bar, sometime in the evening. Robert's boss was there, and they joined him. There was drinking, conversation, the kind of easy socializing that happens in small-town bars. But at some point during that evening, something shifted. The atmosphere changed. According to what Roberts would later tell police, another man in the bar began flirting with Emily. She was a beautiful woman, blonde hair, an engaging smile, the kind of person who naturally drew others to her. The man's attention seemed harmless to Emily, just friendly conversation. To Robert, it was something else entirely. What should have been a minor moment, a stranger's passing comment, easily dismissed, became something that Robert couldn't let go of. The jealousy, the anger, the feeling of being disrespected began to build inside him like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Around 11:30 that night, Emily and Robert left the Blue Cactus Lounge and returned to their hotel room. The security cameras in the hotel captured their images. Emily in casual clothes, walking alongside Robert, heading back upstairs. Neither of them could have known that those would be the last images of Emily Lambert alive. What happened in that hotel room over the next few hours would haunt investigators, devastate a family, and shock a community. Inside room number 21 at the Stevens Inn, the argument that had been simmering since the bar erupted. Robert couldn't let go of the other man's attention toward Emily. The jealousy consumed him. Words became accusations. Accusations became shouting, and shouting became something far worse. What started as an argument became physical. Emily fought back, of course she did. She was strong, determined. Not someone who would just submit to violence. In the struggle, she bit Robert, trying to defend herself, trying to make him stop. But Robert was bigger, stronger, and the rage that had taken hold of him couldn't be reasoned with. He punched her. He kicked her. The blows came again and again, focused on her face, her mouth, her head. Emily fought as long as she could, but eventually the assault was too much. She lost consciousness, collapsing in the hotel room. A normal person, faced with what they'd just done, might have called for help, might have called an ambulance, tried to revive her, panicked at the realization of how far things had gone. But Robert Early didn't do any of those things. Instead, he looked at Emily's unconscious body and made a choice. He picked her up and carried her out of the hotel room. He brought her down to a silver 2007 Hyundai Elantra, placed her inside the vehicle, and drove away from the Stevens Inn. He drove southeast on Highway 62, then turned onto Highway 31, then onto a dirt road called Potash Mines Road, driving into the darkness of the New Mexico desert. This was a remote area, nearly 12 miles from the hotel, past the tiny community of Loving, where ranches spread across the arid landscape, and help was nowhere near. Robert stopped the car in a desolate area near a barn on a ranch property. He got out and pulled Emily from the vehicle, and that's when she began to regain consciousness. The cool night air, the movement, something brought her back. And when she opened her eyes and realized where she was, realized what was happening, she fought. She fought for her life in that dark, lonely place. But Robert had brought something with him, an air pump, the kind used for inflating tires. He struck her with it, again and again, blows to her head, brutal and deliberate. But even then, Emily wouldn't die. She was still conscious, still trying to fight back, still trying to survive. Robert looked around and found a rope. He made a noose and put it around Emily's neck. Then he did something that defies comprehension. He took the other end of that rope, opened the passenger door of his Hyundai, and wedged the rope in the door, securing it tightly. Emily Lambert was still alive. She was conscious, and Robert Early got behind the wheel of his car and began to drive. He dragged her across the desert ground, across rocks and dirt and scrub brush, her body scraped against the terrain, her skin tearing, the noose tightening around her neck. The medical examiner would later determine that Emily was alive when the pressure was applied to her neck. She was alive as she was dragged. She knew what was happening to her in those final terrible moments. Eventually, Robert stopped the car. He got out and looked at Emily's body, lying broken and still on the ground behind the barn. This time she wasn't moving. This time she was gone. Robert removed the rope. He looked around the area, found a metal bar, and struck her several more times, perhaps making sure, perhaps in continued rage. Then he gathered up the items he'd used. The rope, the air pump, the bar, and threw them in different locations. He got back in his car and drove away, leaving Emily's body lying face down in the dirt, wearing only her bra, her jeans and underwear, torn away during the dragging, her blonde hair matted with blood and debris. He drove back to the Stevens Inn as the early morning hours of Sunday, March 2nd, crept toward dawn. Sunday morning came. Robert early woke up alone in the hotel room. He showered. He got dressed. He went about his morning as if nothing had happened, and then he picked up his phone and called Emily's parents. Stephen and Donna Koenig answered the phone, expecting maybe to hear that Emily was having such a good time. She wanted to stay an extra day, or that she'd be home soon and couldn't wait to tell them about her trip. Instead, they heard Robert's voice, filled with what sounded like concern. Emily was missing, he told them. They'd had an argument the night before. She'd stormed out of the hotel room and hadn't come back. He was worried about her. He didn't know where she was. Had they heard from her? The Koenig's world tilted. Emily wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave her cell phone, her wallet, all her belongings, and just vanish. Something was terribly wrong. They told Robert to call the police immediately. Robert did. He filed a missing persons report with the Carlsbad Police Department. He gave them a description of Emily. 5'6", 70 pounds, long blonde hair, a large owl tattoo on her back. He told them his version of events. They'd been at the Blue Cactus Lounge. Another man had flirted with Emily. They'd argued and she'd stormed out around 11:30 Saturday night. He'd assumed she'd cool off and come back. But when morning came and she still wasn't there, he got worried. The police began their investigation. They reviewed security footage from the hotel. They canvassed the area. They interviewed staff and other guests. And they started to notice inconsistencies in Robert's story. Meanwhile, back in Texas, Emily's family mobilized. They created a Facebook page called Finding Emily. Friends shared it. The community rallied. Prayers were offered. Hope was clung to desperately. Donovan Lambert, Emily's ex-husband, was beside himself. The mother of his children was missing in a strange state, and all they could do was wait and hope and pray. Monday, March 3rd, passed with no sign of Emily. The police continued their investigation, and their attention increasingly focused on Robert Early. His story didn't quite add up. The timeline had gaps. His demeanor seemed off. On Tuesday, March 4th, Robert was brought in for another interview. This time the questions were harder. The police had been investigating, and they had reasons to doubt his version of events. They pressed him, and Robert changed his story. This time he told them that Emily had gotten into a truck with another man, a truck driver. Robert said he'd followed them in his Hyundai. The truck turned into a driveway, and a big guy wearing a light-colored cowboy hat came after him with a pipe and hit Emily by accident. Robert panicked and drove away, he claimed. The police didn't believe him. They continued to question him, and finally, under the pressure of their interrogation, Robert Early's lies crumbled. He confessed. He told them about the fight in the hotel room, about knocking her unconscious, about driving her to the remote location, about the air pump, the rope, the dragging. He told them where they could find her body. At 4:30 that Tuesday afternoon, officers drove out to Potash Mines Road, to a ranch near Loving, New Mexico, about 8 miles southeast of Carlsbad. Behind a barn in a desolate stretch of desert, they found her. Emily Lambert was lying face down in the dirt. She was wearing only her bra. The rest of her clothing had been torn away. Her body showed extensive trauma. Scrapes, bruises, tears in her skin. Her blonde hair was matted with blood. The owl tattoo on her back, the one she'd been so proud of, was visible in the harsh afternoon sun. The medical examiner's report would later detail the full horror of what had been done to her. Severe blunt head trauma, extensive injuries consistent with having been dragged behind a vehicle, evidence of ligature strangulation. The cause of death was determined to be blunt trauma and strangulation. And the most heartbreaking detail of all, Emily Lambert was alive when the pressure was applied to her neck. She was alive when she was dragged. She suffered in those final moments, knowing what was happening, unable to stop it. At 1 o'clock in the morning on March 5th, 2014, Carlsbad police officers arrested Robert Glenn Early. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. His bond was set at $1 million, cash only. He was taken to the Eddy County Detention Center, where he would remain awaiting trial. The Koenigs received a call from detectives on Tuesday evening. Their daughter was dead. The nightmare that had begun just days earlier when Robert called to say Emily was missing had ended in the worst possible way. The family released a brief statement on the Finding Emily Facebook page. The essence of Emily is with God. Our family thanks each and every one of you for your outpouring of love, prayers, and support over the last few days. It is with our deepest sorrows that we report her body has been found. At O'Gay, Henry Elementary School, counselors were brought in to help students and staff process the devastating news. The 2013-2014 school year had been Emily's first year teaching. Her students had known her for only a few months, but she'd already made an impact. Parents spoke about how their children had loved her. Colleagues remembered her dedication, her warmth, her genuine care for every child in her classroom. The Richardson Independent School District released a statement. We are deeply saddened by the news of the loss of an ReSD family member, Emily Lambert, a third-grade teacher at O. Henry Elementary. Our condolences to her family, friends, students, and co-workers. Emily's daughters, Eden and Danica, went to live with their father, Donovan Lambert. He would raise them alone now, trying to help them understand why their mother wasn't coming home, why she wouldn't be at their school plays or birthday parties or bedtime stories. Stephen and Donna Koenig, who had already buried one child, a son killed in a car crash 4 years earlier, now had to bury their daughter. On March 8, 2014, a memorial service was held at St. Philip Presbyterian Church in Hearst. Friends, family, colleagues, and students gathered to remember Emily. They shared stories of her kindness, her determination, her love for her daughters. They celebrated a life that had overcome so much and accomplished so much and had been stolen far too soon. She was only 30 years old. A memorial fund was established for Eden and Danica at Wells Fargo. The community that had rallied to find Emily now rallied to support her daughters, knowing that no amount of money could replace their mother, but hoping it might help provide for their future. Robert Early's trial was originally scheduled for July 2014, then moved to April 2015. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite his confession to police. His defense attorneys argued that his statements to police should not be admitted as evidence, claiming they had been improperly obtained. The prosecution disagreed. They had security footage from the hotel, showing Emily and Robert entering their room. They had Robert's changing stories to police. They had his detailed confession in which he described exactly how he killed Emily and where they could find her body. They had the physical evidence from the scene, the rope, the air pump, the injuries to Emily's body that matched Robert's description of events. They had testimony from the medical examiner about the horrific nature of Emily's death. The defense attempted various strategies. They sought to introduce testimony suggesting Emily had been violent in previous relationships, trying to paint Robert as somehow defending himself. The judge excluded this testimony as irrelevant hearsay. They tried to limit graphic crime scene and autopsy photos. The judge allowed them, determining they were necessary to understand the brutality of the crime. They requested a continuance for more preparation time. The judge denied it. The trial began on April 28, 2015, in Carlsbad. The evidence against Robert Early was overwhelming. Witnesses testified. The medical examiner described Emily's injuries in clinical, devastating detail. The security footage was shown. Robert's confession was played for the jury. The defense argued that Robert had not acted with premeditation, that the murder was not first degree but perhaps a lesser charge. They brought in a pharmacology expert to suggest that alcohol had impaired Robert's judgment, but the prosecution pointed to his actions after the initial violence. The decision to drive Emily to a remote location, the continued beating, the deliberate act of tying her to his car and dragging her. These were not the actions of someone who had lost control in a moment of passion. These were calculated decisions made over an extended period. On May 15, 2015, after deliberating, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence. Under New Mexico law, which had abolished the death penalty in 2009, Robert Early was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was the first capital murder case tried and convicted in New Mexico since the repeal of the death penalty. But the legal process wasn't over. Under New Mexico law, first-degree murder convictions trigger an automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court. Robert's attorneys filed their appeal, raising multiple issues: that his statements to police should have been suppressed, that the trial court had made various errors, that the conviction should be overturned. In May 2016, more than a year after his conviction, the New Mexico Supreme Court issued its ruling. The court rejected every one of Robert Early's claims. They held that his statements to police had been properly obtained and admitted. They held that the convictions were supported by the evidence. They affirmed his life sentence. Robert Glenn Early, age 36 at the time of the Supreme Court ruling, would spend the rest of his life in a New Mexico prison. He would never be free again. Attorney General Hector Balderas released a statement. This brutal abuse and extreme violence against a woman is unspeakable. The Supreme Court's decision ensures that justice is served, and this convicted killer will remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Years have passed since that March weekend in 2014. Aidan and Danica Lambert have grown up without their mother, raised by their father who loved Emily enough to remain her friend even after their marriage ended. Stephen and Donna Kunnick have had to live with the unimaginable pain of outliving both of their children. The students at O. Henry Elementary who knew Miss Lambert for just a few months carry memories of a teacher who made them feel special. Emily's case has been featured on television true crime shows, including See No Evil, which detailed how hotel security footage helped solve the case. Podcasters have told her story. Articles have been written, but beneath all the crime procedural details, the legal terminology, the forensic evidence, there's a simple truth that's easy to lose. Emily Lambert was a person. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's friend, someone's colleague. She was a woman who overcame her own learning challenges to become a teacher. She believed in second chances. She'd given herself one by persevering through 10 years to earn her degree. And she'd given Robert Early one by dating him despite his being a virtual stranger. She was excited about the weekend trip to Carlsbad. She was happy according to her parents. When she last spoke to them, she deserved to come home. She deserved to see her daughters grow up. She deserved to continue inspiring students who struggled like she once had. She deserved to grow old with laughter lines around her eyes and grandchildren on her knee. Instead, she became another statistic. Another woman killed by an intimate partner. Another life cut brutally short by domestic violence. Her ex-husband Donovan said it best, in the simplest and most heartbreaking terms. She was a one-of-a-kind person. She was absolutely special. There was no one like her in the world. There wasn't. And now she's gone. And the world is less for it. This is where the story ends tonight. Emily Lambert's life was taken in violence, but her memory lives on in the students she taught, the daughters she loved, the family who misses her every day. May she rest in peace, and may her story remind us all to cherish those we love, to recognize the warning signs of violence, and to remember that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet mountain town of Belgrade, Montana, just outside of Bozeman, the early morning hours of January 7th, 2018, would shatter the peace of a winter night. What began as 3 women simply trying to build new lives would end in tragedy, violence, and a web of manipulation that would eventually ensnare an entire family. This is the story of Lauren Walder DeWise, a woman who tried to escape, and the man who refused to let her go. Lauren Walder DeWise wasn't originally from Montana. She was born in Lakeland, Florida, and grew up in New Jersey, where she graduated from Ewing High School. She was ambitious and driven, eventually earning her degree from the University of West Florida in Pensacola. Teaching was her calling, and she spent several years working as a middle school teacher in Pensacola, shaping young minds and building a career she was proud of. It was during this chapter of her life that she met Joseph Paul DeWise. Friends would later describe how Paul seemed charming at first, the kind of man who could tell stories and make Lauren laugh. They married, and Lauren became stepmother to Paul's 2 children from a previous marriage, a son, Joe, and a daughter, Natalie. Together, Lauren and Paul would have a daughter of their own. The DeWise family eventually relocated to Bozeman, Montana, seeking a fresh start in the Mountain West. Lauren transitioned from teaching to banking, taking a position as a banking center manager at a local institution. To the outside world, they appeared to be just another family trying to make it work in a small Montana town. But behind closed doors, something darker was brewing. At work, Lauren's colleagues began to notice things. She would arrive at the bank with bruises, sometimes a black eye. When asked, Lauren would offer explanations that grew increasingly thin. Her employer documented at least 2 incidents where Lauren came to work visibly injured, and eventually she made an unusual request. If her husband showed up at the workplace, he was to be removed from the premises. Audrey Butler was a personal trainer in Bozeman, and over time she and Lauren formed a friendship that went beyond their professional relationship. Audrey noticed the bruises too. More than that, she noticed the fear. Lauren began to confide in her, sharing pieces of a story that painted a troubling picture of her marriage. Paul DeWise, Lauren revealed, was controlling. He tracked her movements, putting devices on her car to monitor where she went. He needed to know where she was at all times, who she was with, what she was doing. The control extended beyond surveillance. Friends and coworkers would later testify that Lauren had suffered physical abuse at Paul's hands. She told them he had struck her on multiple occasions. And then there were the threats. Paul had audio recordings on his phone, recordings where his own voice could be heard telling Lauren that he would kill her. He told her that if she left him, he would kill not just her, but everyone around her. These weren't idle threats made in the heat of an argument and forgotten. They were calculated, repeated, designed to keep Lauren trapped in a cage of fear. But by the fall of 2017, Lauren had made a decision. She was done. In November of 2017, Lauren moved out. She couldn't stay in that house anymore. Couldn't live under Paul's watchful eye and constant threats. Audrey Butler, her friend and trainer, offered her a room. Audrey owned a home on Idaho Street in Belgrade, just a short drive from Bozeman. It was a modest house, but it represented something crucial to Lauren: safety. Living at Audrey's house meant Lauren wasn't alone. Another young woman named Ashley Van Himmert also rented a room there. The 3 women formed a small household, a refuge where Lauren could begin to imagine what her life might look like, free from Paul's control. But leaving Paul DeWise didn't mean she was free from him. He showed up at Audrey's house multiple times in the weeks after Lauren moved out. Sometimes he was aggressive. Other times he tried different tactics. The pattern was clear. Paul wasn't going to let Lauren go easily. Lauren and Paul were now discussing divorce. They had even scheduled a meeting for January 7th, 2018, to talk through the details. Lauren was nervous about it, but she was moving forward. She was taking her life back, one difficult step at a time. Paul, meanwhile, was spiraling. His daughter Natalie would later describe him as violent and controlling, not just with Lauren, but as a presence that dominated their household. In the weeks leading up to that January night, Paul sent Lauren numerous text messages. The content of those messages showed a man who was losing control of the narrative he'd built, and who couldn't accept that Lauren was slipping away. The evening of January 6, 2018 began like many others. At the DeWise home in Bozeman, Paul's children were there: 17-year-old Natalie, 15-year-old Joe, and his youngest daughter, the 4-year-old he shared with Lauren. Paul claimed he was sick that day, that he'd spent most of it dozing in his recliner. But Paul was planning something, and horrifically he was going to involve his teenage son. According to Joe's later testimony, his father asked him to leave his cell phone at home. This should have been Joe's first warning that something was wrong. But when you're 15 years old and your father is a controlling, sometimes violent presence in your life, you don't ask too many questions. Paul told his son to get in the car. They were going for a drive. Before they left, Paul gave Joe a knitted ski mask and rubber gloves. As they drove south from Bozeman toward Belgrade, Joe felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew it wasn't good. They drove to Idaho Street. Paul parked a couple of houses away from Audrey Butler's home, where Lauren was sleeping. They sat there in the darkness for 30 minutes, just sitting, waiting. What was going through Paul's mind during those 30 minutes? Was he having second thoughts, or was he simply waiting for the perfect moment? Finally, Paul pulled out a .22 caliber pistol. Joe's confusion turned to terror. Together, they approached the house through the backyard. Footprints in the snow would later trace their path, coming from the east side of the residence, around the north side, and then to the back door. Paul kicked in the door. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Paul DeWise and his son entered the dark house. They moved through it quickly, Paul leading the way with the gun in his hand. The first room they entered was Ashley Van Hemmert's. Ashley woke to the sound of the door breaking, to the sight of a masked figure standing over her. She barely had time to speak. According to Joe's testimony, there was a brief exchange. Ashley, disoriented and terrified, asked who they were. Paul shot her. Not once, but multiple times. 4 bullets entered Ashley's body, including one to the back of her head. Ashley collapsed. She was still alive but gravely wounded, bleeding on the floor of her bedroom. Paul left her there, moving to the next room. Lauren's room. Paul opened the door and stepped just inside the threshold. In the darkness, Lauren gasped. Joe, standing in the hallway, recognized that gasp. He'd lived with Lauren for years. He knew the sound of her voice, even in that moment of pure terror. Paul shot his estranged wife multiple times. Lauren Walder Dawes, the teacher who'd moved to Montana for a fresh start, the banking manager who'd tried so hard to build a new life, died there in her bedroom. Paul and Joe ran. They fled through the house, out into the cold Montana night, back to the car. On the way back to Bozeman, Paul stopped at a town pump gas station. Security footage would later show him entering the store, acting as if nothing had happened. Back home in Bozeman, the horror wasn't over. Paul instructed his 15-year-old son to get rid of the murder weapon. Joe took the .22 caliber pistol and walked to Bozeman Pond, less than a mile from their home on Silver Maple Drive. He threw it into the water. Later that night, Paul discovered live .22 caliber rounds in his bedroom. He sent Joe back to the pond multiple times to dispose of those as well. Natalie, Joe's older sister, was asleep when they returned. Early the next morning, on January 7th, Paul woke her up. He flipped on her bedroom light and told her to get up. He needed to talk to her. Standing there in her doorway, Paul DeWise confessed to his daughter. He told her he had done something bad. He had killed Lauren, and he'd taken Joe with him when he did it. Paul coached Natalie on what to say if anyone asked questions. He was already building his alibi, already pulling his children into his web of lies. That morning they went to church. Can you imagine that? Hours after murdering his estranged wife and nearly killing another woman, Paul DeWise sat in a church pew with his children, acting as if everything was normal. Audrey Butler had been away from home that night. When she returned the morning of January 7th, she walked into a scene of horror. She found Lauren first, in her bedroom. Even from the doorway, Audrey could see that Lauren was dead. The reality of what she was seeing barely had time to register before she saw Ashley. Ashley Van Hemert was lying on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by blood. But unlike Lauren, Ashley was still alive. Her eyes were wide open. She looked at Audrey and said 3 words, "Please help me." Ashley had been lying there for approximately 9 hours, shot 4 times, bleeding, wondering if she was going to die. The bullet that entered the back of her head should have killed her. By any reasonable measure, she should not have survived. But somehow she had. Audrey called 911 immediately. Belgrade police officer Jared Robinson was one of the first officers on the scene. His body camera footage captured the chaos of that morning, footage that would later be shown to a jury. Paramedics rushed Ashley to the hospital. She was alive, but her injuries were severe and life-threatening. Meanwhile, investigators began processing the crime scene. They found 4.22 caliber shell casings in Lauren's bedroom. They photographed the footprints in the snow leading to the back door. They documented the kicked-in door, the blood, the evidence of a brutal attack, and they started looking for Paul DeWise. Detectives with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office had their primary suspect almost immediately. Everything pointed to Paul DeWise. The documented history of abuse, the threats he'd made, the fact that Lauren had just left him and they were discussing divorce. On January 11th, 2018, 4 days after the murder, officers arrested Paul DeWise. When they took him into custody, he had all 3 of his children with him, including the 4-year-old daughter he shared with Lauren. That little girl's mother had just been murdered, and her father was the one who'd done it. During his initial interview with investigators, Paul DeWise's performance was chilling. When detectives told him there had been issues at Lauren's house the night before, Paul feigned shock. "Oh my God," he said, crossing his arms and rocking back and forth. He acted as if this was the first he was hearing of any of it. He told investigators he had no idea what had happened. He'd been home that night, sick, resting in his recliner. The only time he'd left the house, he claimed, was around midnight when he went to the store to buy beer. He'd had a few drinks and gone to bed around 2 in the morning. He insisted he had nothing to do with Lauren's death, but investigators were building their case. They found ammunition at Paul's house that matched the ammunition used in the murders. The footprints in the snow matched Paul's footwear. And most damningly, his children were starting to talk. Joe had initially told police what his father had coached him to say, that they'd stayed home that night and watched movies. But detectives knew that story didn't add up. They knew Paul's son had been with him. The pressure on the teenage boy was immense. Eventually, Joe told the truth. He gave investigators a detailed account of that night, the drive to Belgrade, the masks and gloves, the kicked-in door, the shootings. It was devastating testimony, made all the more heartbreaking by the fact that Paul had forced his own son to be complicit in murder. Natalie came forward as well, telling investigators about her father's confession the morning after the murder, and how he tried to coach her into lying for him. Paul DeWise was charged with deliberate homicide for Lauren's death, and attempted deliberate homicide for shooting Ashley Van Hemert. His bond was set at $1 million. While Paul sat in the Gallatin County Detention Center, he made a decision that would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against him. Despite a court order prohibiting him from contacting witnesses or family members, Paul called his daughter Natalie. The first call, made on February 6, 2018, ended immediately when the recording advisory played. But Paul tried again the next morning, at 6:40 a.m. This time the call lasted over 12 minutes, and the entire conversation was recorded. In that call, Paul told his 17-year-old daughter that he knew he wasn't supposed to be talking to her. But then he said something shocking. He told Natalie that Joe, her 15-year-old brother, had said that Paul took him along and was responsible for what happened. "So that means to me," Paul said, "that Joe must have done it." He told Natalie that it was real important that Joe admit to the shooting, because if Joe confessed, then Paul would get the fuck out of here. He tried to reassure Natalie that if Joe took the blame, he would only be in jail for a little while because he was a juvenile, and then his life would just go back to normal. Paul painted a picture of jail as being not so bad, trying to convince his daughter to convince her brother to falsely confess to murder. He talked about how the jails were safe and nice, how the food was good. What Paul didn't seem to realize, or perhaps didn't care about, was that by making this call, he was creating evidence of witness tampering. He was demonstrating his willingness to throw his own teenage son under the bus to save himself. It was manipulation at its most calculated and cruel. When prosecutors later charged Paul with felony witness tampering, the jail call recordings became central to that case. They showed not just a man trying to avoid responsibility, but a father willing to destroy his son's life to preserve his own freedom. While Paul sat in jail making phone calls and building alibis, Ashley Van Hemert was fighting for her life and learning to live with the aftermath of what Paul had done to her. She had been shot 4 times. One of those bullets had entered the back of her head. The injuries were catastrophic. Ashley spent months in the hospital and in rehabilitation. The physical recovery was difficult enough, but the psychological trauma added another layer of challenge. Ashley had no memory of the actual shooting. She remembered going to sleep that night and then nothing until she woke up on the floor, badly wounded, knowing something terrible had happened, but not understanding what. The doctors told Ashley's family that by all rights she shouldn't have survived. The fact that she was alive at all was extraordinary, but survival came at a cost. Ashley faced a long road of surgeries, physical therapy, and learning to manage the ongoing effects of her injuries. Through it all, Ashley showed remarkable strength. She would later say that her faith sustained her through the darkest moments. When people asked her what they could pray for, she told them to pray for her body, for Paul's children, and for Paul's soul. On December 2nd, 2019, nearly 2 years after Lauren's murder, Joseph Paul DeWise's trial began in Gallatin County District Court. Judge Holly Brown presided over a proceeding that would span 7 days and include some of the most emotionally charged testimony the courthouse had seen. The prosecution, led by Chief Deputy County Attorney Eric Kitzmiller, built their case methodically. They presented the physical evidence, the footprints in the snow, the ammunition match, the recovered murder weapon that ice fishermen had found in Bozeman Pond. They presented the digital evidence, the text messages Paul had sent Lauren, the recordings on his phone where he threatened to kill her. They brought forward witnesses who testified to the abuse Lauren had suffered. Co-workers described the bruises, the black eye, her fear of Paul. Audrea Butler testified about finding the crime scene, about Lauren's terror in the weeks before her death, about Paul showing up at the house repeatedly. But the most powerful testimony came from Paul's own children. Natalie DeWise, now 19 years old, took the stand on December 4th. She testified about the morning her father woke her up and confessed to killing Lauren. She described her father as violent and controlling, detailing the atmosphere of fear he created in their home. She told the jury about the jail call, about Paul asking her to convince Joe to take the blame, and how she couldn't do it because it wasn't the truth. The next day, December 5th, it was Joe's turn. Now 17 years old and living in Florida with his mother, Joe returned to Montana to testify against his father. His account of that night was detailed and devastating. He described how his father told him to leave his phone at home, how they drove to Belgrade wearing masks and gloves, how they sat in the car for 30 minutes before Paul pulled out the gun. Joe walked the jury through the break-in, the shootings, the flight back to Bozeman, the stop at Town Pump, the disposal of the murder weapon in the pond. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Annie DeWolf tried to suggest that Joe had made up his story after talking to his mother, Paul's ex-wife. She suggested that investigators had pressured Joe into implicating his father to save himself. But Joe held firm. He said no, that wasn't what happened. He was telling the truth. The defense argued that the state hadn't proven Paul was the shooter, beyond a reasonable doubt. They pointed out that no witnesses had seen Paul at the house. They suggested others could have committed the crime, but the mountain of evidence against Paul was difficult to overcome. Ashley Van Hemert also testified, though she had no memory of the shooting itself. She spoke about the aftermath, about the long recovery, about what Paul DeWise had taken from her that night. On the final day of testimony, Paul DeWise took the stand in his own defense. It was a calculated risk, but Paul seemed confident he could convince the jury of his innocence. He testified that the prosecution had mischaracterized his statements throughout the investigation. He maintained that he'd been falsely accused. "I didn't do it," he told the jury. "I don't deserve to go to prison, and what you've done is wrong, okay? That is the truth." When confronted with the audio recordings where he threatened Lauren, Paul's demeanor changed. He became defensive, agitated. He claimed he never threatened his wife in any way like that. He said he wasn't a controlling person, that he didn't even know how to be controlling, and that anyone who knew him knew that about him. Paul claimed he was sick the night of January 6th. He'd been dozing on and off in his recliner. He made a big batch of soup. Around midnight, he'd gone to Town Pump to buy beer. He'd had a few drinks, talked with his kids, and gone to bed around 2 in the morning. It was all very fuzzy, he said. When asked about the jail call to his daughter, Paul admitted he'd made it, but denied asking Natalie to put the blame on Joe. He claimed the state just wanted to put pressure on him so he would crack and take the blame. Paul insisted that the real killer was still out there, that he'd been wrongfully accused because of prosecutorial misconduct. The jury didn't believe him. After 7 days of testimony, the case went to the jury on December 10th, 2019. They deliberated for a little less than 2.5 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Natalie and Joe were there, along with Ashley Van Hemert and her family. Lauren's friends and co-workers filled the gallery. The 4 persons stood, guilty on all counts, deliberate homicide and the death of Lauren Walder. DeWise attempted deliberate homicide for shooting Ashley Van Hemert and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some people wept. Paul DeWise showed no emotion. For Eric Kitzmiller, the prosecutor, it was the culmination of nearly 2 years of work. In later interviews, he emphasized how brave Paul's children had been in coming forward. They were very brave in coming forward, he said, and it was just part of the process of them getting out from underneath his influence. 2 months later, on February 4th, 2020, Joseph Paul DeWise returned to court for sentencing. This time, the people whose lives he'd shattered would have the opportunity to speak directly to him. Ashley Van Hemert's family went first. Her brother Terrell addressed Paul directly. "You tried to kill my sister," he said. "You did a pretty darn good job of trying to do it. Unless God intervened, she would be dead. She was on the ground for, I believe, almost 9 hours. Wondering if she was going to die. What do you think that felt like?" Then Ashley herself spoke. In one of the most powerful moments of the sentencing hearing, she looked Paul DeWise in the eye and said, "Mr. DeWise, thank you for looking at me. It is well with my soul what you have done to me." She gave Paul a Bible with a poem inside that she and her brother had written together. Before reading it, she recited the words aloud. "The night was quiet. All was calm. We were just there sleeping in our home. Then you broke in. The shots rang out. You killed Lauren and left me for dead. By the grace of God, I survived and I lived to be a testimony. When people ask me what they can pray for, I say for my body, your children, and your soul. This life is short. Eternity is forever. And you need Jesus more than my body. Whole." Ashley told Paul that he could have tried to kill her, but he didn't have the final say on when someone's life was over. She said he took Lauren's life and took away a mother from his daughter. One by one, members of Ashley's family stood and told Paul they forgave him. Then Paul spoke. He took the stand for nearly 50 minutes. "I feel for Ashley," he said. "She's a special lady." But even at his sentencing, Paul maintained his innocence. He complained that the prosecutor made the story better every time I hear it. He insisted he'd never had problems with his temper, that nobody had ever accused him of being manipulative or controlling. The prosecution asked for 220 years. The defense asked for 62 years, with eligibility for parole. Judge Holly Brown had heard enough. When she pronounced sentence, her words were unequivocal. "The circumstances of this crime are outrageous," Judge Brown said. "They are aggravated, and they are intolerable." She sentenced Paul DeWise to 100 years for the murder of Lauren Walder DeWise, with an additional 10 years for using a firearm. 100 years for the attempted murder of Ashley Van Hemert, with an additional 10 years for using a firearm. The sentences would run consecutively, not concurrently. 220 years in Montana State Prison, with no eligibility for parole. Joseph Paul DeWise would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The ripples of that January night in 2018 continue to spread through the lives of everyone involved. Joe and Natalie DeWise, the children who had to testify against their father, carry burdens no child should have to bear. They not only lost their stepmother Lauren, but they lost their father to his own violence and manipulation. They had to stand up in court and tell the truth, knowing it would send their father to prison forever. The courage that took is almost unimaginable. Paul and Lauren's youngest daughter lost her mother to murder and her father to prison. She will grow up with the knowledge of what happened, with the weight of that history. Ashley Van Hemert survived, but she lives with the physical and emotional scars of what Paul DeWise did to her. She continues to work on her recovery, supported by her family and her faith. Her testimony and her presence at the trial and sentencing were testaments to her resilience. Lauren Walder DeWise didn't get to escape. Despite doing everything she was supposed to do, leaving the relationship, finding a safe place to stay, documenting the abuse, working toward divorce, Paul DeWise still found a way to take her life. This case highlights the deadly reality of domestic violence and the difficulty of escaping an abusive relationship. Lauren's story is a reminder that leaving is often the most dangerous time for victims of domestic abuse. It's a reminder that restraining orders and documentation, while important, aren't always enough to stop someone determined to commit violence. The case also reveals how domestic abusers manipulate not just their partners, but everyone around them, including their own children, Paul DeWise tried to turn his son into an accomplice, and then attempted to frame that same son for the murder. He used fear and control to keep his family silent, even from behind bars. But in the end, the truth came out. Joe and Natalie found the courage to speak. Ashley survived to tell her story, and a jury saw through Paul DeWise's lies and manipulation. Joseph Paul DeWise is currently incarcerated in the Montana State Prison System, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He continues to maintain his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his own children. Lauren Walder DeWise is remembered by friends and co-workers as a dedicated professional, a caring person, and a woman who tried to build a better life for herself and her daughter. Her death was a tragedy that didn't have to happen. This is the story of Lauren Walder DeWise. A story of control, violence, and the ultimate price of trying to break free. A story that ended on a cold January night in Belgrade, Montana, but whose echoes continue to this day. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that reminds us just how vulnerable the youngest among us truly are. This is the story of Trinity Kyles, a 2-year-old girl whose life ended on a spring afternoon in Gwinnett County, Georgia. It's a story about trust, about the choices we make when no one is watching, and about how the justice system responded when the unthinkable happened. As we settle in, let me tell you what happened on May 2nd, 2021. The Quality Inn on Venture Parkway in Duluth, Georgia isn't the kind of place people write home about. It's a mid-range hotel in the Atlanta suburbs, the type of establishment where travelers stop for a night on their way to somewhere else, where families stay when they're between homes, when life has put them in a temporary situation. In the spring of 2021, one of those rooms housed a young mother named Rosie Marie Kyles, her 2-year-old daughter Trinity, and Rosie's boyfriend, a 24-year-old man named Malik Kyrie Kennedy. Trinity was, by all accounts, a bright-eyed little girl who loved the simple pleasures of childhood. Her family would later remember that she adored watching Sesame Street, those colorful characters that have entertained generations of toddlers. She loved getting her hair done, the kind of small ritual that makes a little girl feel special, like a princess. She loved playing at the park, running on unsteady toddler legs across grass and wood chips, feeling the wind on her face. And she loved taking photos with her family, those frozen moments that become so precious later when someone is gone. But Trinity's life wasn't filled with the stability most children need. At 2 years old, she was living in a hotel room with her mother and her mother's boyfriend. The exact circumstances that brought them to the Quality Inn aren't fully documented in the public record. But we know this much: Rosie was working, trying to provide for her daughter. And on May 2nd, a Sunday afternoon, she needed someone to watch Trinity while she went to work. She asked Malik Kennedy, her boyfriend, to babysit. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. We don't know exactly what time Rosie left for work that day. What we do know is that at some point in the afternoon, Trinity was left alone in that hotel room with Kennedy, just the two of them. A grown man and a toddler who still took naps, who was still learning how to navigate the world. What happened in those hours is something that can only be reconstructed from evidence, from the story Kennedy eventually told, and from the physical reality that first responders would encounter later that evening. At some point during the afternoon, Kennedy gave Trinity melatonin. This detail would become important later. Melatonin is a supplement people use to help with sleep, a hormone that tells the body it's time to rest. Parents sometimes give it to children who have trouble sleeping, though medical professionals generally advise caution with children so young. Kennedy would later claim that giving Trinity melatonin was all he did, that it was an innocent act, meant to help the toddler sleep while he watched over her. But the medical evidence would tell a very different story. According to what prosecutors would later present in court, at some point during that afternoon, Kennedy began slamming Trinity's head against the headboard of the hotel room bed. Again and again, small child's skull meeting solid wood with terrible force. Try to imagine the sound, the impact, the 2-year-old's confused cries. Trinity lost consciousness. Her small body went limp. Her breathing changed. Everything about her state should have told Kennedy that something was catastrophically wrong. But Kennedy didn't call 911. He didn't call Trinity's mother. He didn't rush the child to the hotel lobby and scream for help. Instead, according to the evidence, he waited. 2 hours passed. 120 minutes during which Trinity lay unconscious in that hotel room while Kennedy did nothing. And then Trinity woke up. For a 2-year-old who had just suffered the kind of head trauma that had rendered her unconscious, waking up would have been disorienting, frightening, painful, beyond what a child that age could process or express. She might have cried. She might have been confused, reaching for her mother who wasn't there. What Kennedy did next was, in many ways, even more horrifying than what had come before. He picked up this injured, traumatized child, and he shook her, violently, hard enough that her small body whipped back and forth, hard enough that her brain rattled inside her skull, hard enough that she lost consciousness again. This time, she wouldn't wake up. What happened next was captured in Kennedy's own eventual confession, and in the medical evidence. Trinity, lying unconscious in that hotel room, began to have a seizure. Her small body convulsed. Blood appeared at her mouth. Kennedy watched. He took a cloth or tissue and he wiped the blood away from her mouth. He saw her seizing. He saw the blood. He knew on some level that something was desperately wrong. And still, he didn't call for help. Instead, Kennedy drank alcohol. He smoked marijuana. He turned on a video game console and began to play. He scrolled through social media on his phone, watching videos, seeing what other people were posting about their normal Sunday afternoons. In that hotel room, a 2-year-old girl was dying. Her brain was swelling from the trauma it had sustained. Bleeding was occurring inside her skull. Every minute that passed without medical intervention was another minute during which Trinity's chances of survival dropped. And Kennedy played video games. It's hard to fathom this part of the story. The human brain wants to make sense of things, to find some explanation that makes the inexplicable somehow understandable. But sometimes there is no explanation that satisfies. Sometimes people do things that exist beyond the boundary of what we want to believe humans are capable of. Kennedy didn't seem to be in a panic. He wasn't pacing the room, trying to figure out what to do. He wasn't frozen in shock or paralyzed by fear. He was drinking, smoking, playing games, living in those moments as if nothing unusual was happening, as if a dying child wasn't lying nearby. The clock kept ticking. Trinity's brain kept swelling. Her small body, resilient in the way children's bodies are, kept fighting. But it was a fight she couldn't win without help. And the help didn't come. It was 5:42 in the evening when Rosie Marie Kyles returned to the Quality Inn. She had worked her shift. She was probably tired. Probably thinking about seeing her daughter. Probably looking forward to the simple comfort of being reunited with Trinity after a day apart. What she found when she opened that hotel room door was every parent's worst nightmare. Trinity wasn't responsive. She wasn't breathing normally. Her skin color was wrong. Something was terribly obviously wrong. Rosie called 911. Immediately, the call came in at 5:42 p.m. Her daughter wasn't breathing. Trinity wasn't waking up from her nap. Kennedy, still there in the room, offered an explanation. He told Rosie that he had given Trinity melatonin to help her sleep. That was it. Just melatonin. The child was sleeping deeply. That's all. Nothing to worry about. But Rosie could see that this wasn't sleep. This was something else entirely. The Dragnete County Fire Department arrived at the Quality Inn shortly after the call. These first responders have seen many things over the course of their careers. They've revived people who weren't breathing. They've performed miracles in the back of ambulances and in living rooms and in hotel rooms. But they couldn't revive Trinity. They tried. They did everything they were trained to do. Every protocol designed to restart a life that's slipping away. But Trinity's injuries were too severe. The time that had passed between when she was hurt and when she received help was too long. The firefighters and paramedics could see immediately that something was very wrong beyond just a failure to revive. Trinity had bruises. Multiple bruises. Her cheeks showed distinct patterns, impressions that looked like fingers, like fingernails digging into soft toddler skin. Her eye was swollen. Her forehead was swollen. There were bruises scattered across her small body. This wasn't a child who had peacefully failed to wake from a nap. This was a child who had been hurt badly. Trinity was pronounced dead at the scene. When police officers arrived at the Quality Inn, they immediately recognized that they weren't looking at a natural death or an accident. The bruising on Trinity's body told the story all on its own. The finger and fingernail impressions on her cheeks, the swollen eye, the swollen forehead, the additional bruises on her body. Rosie, devastated, told police what Kennedy had said to her about the melatonin, about Trinity supposedly sleeping. But when police pressed Kennedy for more information, when they asked him to explain the visible injuries on Trinity's body, his story began to change. He admitted, at first, that he had pinched Trinity on her cheeks because she had misbehaved. He made it sound minor, like a disciplinary action that had perhaps been a little too rough. Just pinches. That's all. That's where the marks came from. But the injuries didn't match that story. The medical evidence wouldn't support it. Kennedy was arrested that night and taken to the Gwinnett County Jail. Initially, he was charged with felony murder and first-degree cruelty to children. He was held without bond, meaning he would stay in jail while the investigation continued. And the case moved forward. The next day, May 3rd, 2021, an autopsy was performed on Trinity's body. The Gwinnett County medical examiner conducted the examination, documenting every injury, every mark, every indication of what had been done to this child. The autopsy revealed something that hadn't been visible on the outside. Trinity had sustained a closed head injury to the back of her head. This meant bleeding and trauma inside her skull, damage to her brain. This was the kind of injury that doesn't happen from a fall off a couch or a bump during normal toddler activity. This was the kind of injury that comes from significant force, from violent impact. The medical examiner's determination was clear and unequivocal. Trinity's death was a homicide. With that determination, the case officially became a murder investigation. Kennedy's charges would later be expanded to include malice murder and aggravated battery. But on that day, the focus was on documenting everything that had happened, on building a case that would stand up in court, on making sure that whoever was responsible for Trinity's death would be held accountable. After Kennedy's arrest in May 2021, the wheels of the criminal justice system began to turn. But as anyone familiar with the legal system knows, those wheels turned slowly, very slowly. Kennedy remained in the Gwinnett County Jail without bond. He wasn't going anywhere, but it would be nearly 3 years before his case went to trial. 3 years during which Trinity's family lived with their grief. 3 years during which a mother tried to process the fact that she had left her daughter with someone she trusted, and that decision had resulted in Trinity's death. 3 years during which birthdays came and went. Holidays were marked by absence, and the memory of a 2-year-old girl was all that remained. Trinity would have turned 3 in April of 2022, then 4 in April of 2023, and 5 in April of 2024. In her obituary, which was published shortly after her death, Trinity's family wrote about who she was, about her love for Sesame Street, and getting her hair done and playing at the park and taking photos with family. These small details are all that remain. The tiny brushstrokes that paint a picture of a life that barely had a chance to begin. The investigation continued during those 3 years. Prosecutors built their case, gathering evidence, preparing witnesses, constructing the narrative they would present to a jury. Defense attorneys prepared their response, whatever that would be. And then, in May of 2024, 3 years to the month after Trinity's death, the case finally went to trial. The trial began on May 1st, 2024, in Gwinnett County Superior Court. Mallet K. Kennedy, now 27 years old, faced serious charges. Malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, aggravated battery, and first-degree cruelty to children. The prosecution presented their case over several days. They called witnesses. They introduced evidence. They walked the jury through what had happened in that Quality Inn hotel room on May 2nd. The physical evidence was damning. The autopsy report, the photographs of Trinity's injuries, the closed head injury to the back of her skull, the timeline of events that showed Kennedy had waited hours before seeking help. But perhaps even more powerful was the story prosecutors told about what Kennedy did while Trinity lay dying. The drinking, the marijuana, the video games, the social media scrolling, the complete and utter disregard for the life of a child who was in his care. Kennedy had allegedly slammed Trinity's head against the headboard until she lost consciousness. When she woke up 2 hours later, he had violently shaken her until she lost consciousness again. And then, as she seized and bled, he had done nothing to help her. The defense had to respond to all of this somehow. But what can you say in the face of such evidence? The injuries were real. The timeline was documented. Kennedy's own changing stories, from the melatonin claim to the admission of pinching, showed a pattern of deception. The jury began deliberations on Wednesday afternoon, May 1st. They continued through most of the day on Thursday, May 2nd. May 2nd, 2024. Exactly 3 years to the day after Trinity's death. The jury reached their verdict, late on May 2nd. They filed back into the courtroom. The four-persons stood, and they announced their decision. Guilty on all counts. Malice. Murder. Guilty. Felony murder. First count. Guilty. Felony murder. Second count. Guilty. Aggravated battery. Guilty. First-degree cruelty to children. Guilty. Kennedy showed no visible reaction, according to news reports. He stood there as his fate was sealed, as the jury formally declared that he was responsible for the death of 2-year-old Trinity Kyles. The next day, Friday, May 3rd, 2024, Kennedy appeared in court again for sentencing. The judge had a decision to make about what punishment fit this crime. In Georgia, murder convictions carry serious sentences. But in this case, with these particular circumstances, with the victim so young and so vulnerable, with the evidence of such callous disregard for human life, there was really only one appropriate sentence. The judge sentenced Malachi Kitty Kennedy to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This means Kennedy will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He will never be free. He will grow old, if he lives that long, in a prison cell. He will never again have the opportunity to hurt another child. He will never again have the freedom he took for granted on that May afternoon when he chose violence over care, when he chose indifference over action. After the sentencing, Gwinnett County District Attorney Patsy Austin Gatson released a statement. Her words captured both the grief of the case and the small comfort that justice, when it finally comes, can provide. We continue to grieve with Trinity's family for this senseless loss, she said. Although this verdict and sentencing cannot replace this little girl's future or quell her family's pain, our hope is that it brings them justice and provides them with some solace. It's a measured statement, the kind that prosecutors give when a case concludes. But behind those careful words is a recognition of a difficult truth. Nothing can bring Trinity back. No verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can undo what was done. Trinity would have turned 5 years old the month before Kennedy was convicted. She should have been starting kindergarten, making friends, learning to read, growing into the person she was meant to become. Instead, she's gone. Because on one May afternoon, the person trusted to care for her chose violence, and then chose to do nothing as she died. The murder of Trinity Kyles isn't a mystery in the traditional true crime sense. There was no question about who was responsible, no twists in the investigation, no surprise revelations in the courtroom. From the moment police saw Trinity's injuries, from the moment the autopsy revealed the head trauma, the path was clear. But in some ways, this makes the case even more haunting. Because the question isn't who did it. The question is, how could someone do this? How does a person look at a 2-year-old child? A toddler who depends on adults for everything, who trusts that the grown-ups around her will keep her safe, and choose to hurt her. How does someone slam a child's head against a headboard? How does someone shake a child so violently that she loses consciousness? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how does someone watch a child see blood coming from her mouth, know that something is terribly wrong, and then just turn on a video game? Child abuse cases are always difficult to process. They violate something fundamental in how we think human beings should behave. We want to believe that adults, especially adults who are in a parental or caregiver role, will protect children, that the instinct to nurture and protect the vulnerable will override everything else. But as cases like Trinity's remind us, that's not always true. Some people, for reasons we may never fully understand, are capable of terrible cruelty toward the most defenseless among us. The statistics on child abuse in America are sobering. According to the Children's Bureau, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Approximately 618,000 children were victims of abuse or neglect in 20. That's the most recent year for which complete data was available at the time of Trinity's death. Of those victims, about 1,750 died as a result of abuse or neglect. Most of those deaths involved very young children. Children under 3 years old accounted for more than 70% of all child abuse fatalities. The very youngest children, those who can't speak up for themselves, who can't run away, who can't tell anyone what's happening to them, are the most vulnerable. And in most cases, the perpetrators aren't strangers. They're not unknown predators lurking in the shadows. They're parents, step-parents, parents' romantic partners, family members, caregivers, people who are supposed to love and protect the children in their care. Trinity's case fits this heartbreaking pattern. She was killed by her mother's boyfriend, someone who was trusted to watch over her for a few hours on a Sunday afternoon. Trinity's death occurred at the Quality Inn in Duluth, Georgia, but it could have happened anywhere. Child abuse and child homicide are not limited by geography or demographics. They happen in cities and in rural areas, in wealthy neighborhoods and in poor ones, in stable family homes and in temporary housing. What Trinity's case does highlight is the particular vulnerability of children in unstable living situations. Living in a hotel, even temporarily, often reflects some kind of family crisis or transition. Maybe it's a job loss, eviction, a relationship ending, a cross-country move. Whatever the reason, it's a situation that brings stress, and stress can be a contributing factor to abuse. This isn't to excuse what Kennedy did. Nothing excuses it. But understanding the circumstances that can increase risk is important for prevention. Families in crisis need support, not judgment. They need resources, not isolation. And children in these situations need extra vigilance from the community. From teachers, from doctors, from neighbors, from anyone who might notice that something is wrong. In the aftermath of Trinity's death, there were some who asked whether more could have been done. Should someone have noticed something earlier? Were there warning signs that were missed? It's natural to ask these questions when a child dies, to look for the moment when intervention might have prevented tragedy. But the truth is, there isn't always a clear warning sign. Sometimes abuse happens behind closed doors, in private moments when no one else is watching. Sometimes the first sign that something is wrong is when it's already too late. What we can do is create systems that protect children as much as possible. That means thorough background checks for anyone working with children. It means training for teachers and childcare providers to recognize signs of abuse. It means making it easy and safe for people to report suspected abuse. It means ensuring that Child Protective Services have the resources they need to investigate reports and intervene when necessary. And it means taking child abuse seriously. Every time, without exception, because every child deserves to be safe. Every child deserves to grow up without fear, without pain, without the threat of violence from the people who are supposed to love them. Today, Malik Kikri Kennedy is serving his life sentence without parole in a Georgia state prison. He's 27 years old, which means he has decades of life ahead of him. Decades that will be spent in a prison cell, in a controlled environment where his every movement is monitored, where his freedom is completely restricted. Life without parole is one of the harshest sentences in the American criminal justice system. It means exactly what it says. Kennedy will never be released. There's no possibility of parole. No chance that good behavior or time served will earn him a second chance at freedom. He will die in prison. Some people view this as justice served. They believe that someone who killed a child, especially in such a brutal and callous manner, deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars. That he forfeited his right to freedom when he took Trinity's life and her future. Others have more complicated views about life sentences, about whether anyone can truly be beyond redemption, about what the purpose of incarceration should be. These are philosophical and ethical questions that our society continues to grapple with. Questions without easy answers. But whatever one's views on sentencing and punishment, the fact remains. Kennedy will never again have the opportunity to hurt a child. That much is certain. One person who rarely appears in the news coverage of Trinity's case is Rosie Marie Kyles, Trinity's mother. She's mentioned in the initial reports, identified as the person who called 911, noted as having asked Kennedy to babysit. But after that, she fades from the public narrative. This is probably intentional. Rosie didn't want media attention. She wanted to grieve in private, to process the unimaginable trauma of losing her child in such a horrific way. And then you walk into that hotel room and find your daughter dying. Your 2-year-old, who was fine when you left, who should have just been napping, is not breathing, is covered in bruises, has been hurt in ways you can't immediately comprehend. And the person you trusted to watch her tells you it's nothing, just melatonin, just a deep sleep. But you can see it's not that. You can see something is terribly wrong. That none of those what-ifs change the fundamental truth. Rosie didn't hurt Trinity. Rosie didn't make the choice to slam her daughter's head against a headboard. Rosie didn't shake her child until she lost consciousness. Rosie didn't sit playing video games while Trinity seized and bled. Kennedy made those choices. Kennedy alone is responsible for what happened in that hotel room. But knowing that intellectually doesn't necessarily ease the emotional burden of being Trinity's mother, of being the person who made the decision to leave her daughter with Kennedy that day. Rosie has to live with this for the rest of her life. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she's Trinity's mother. And Trinity is gone. That's a grief that never fully heals. A loss that echoes through every day that follows. What is Trinity Kyles' legacy? She was only 2 years old when she died. She didn't have time to make her mark on the world in the way that older people do. She didn't have a career or create art or raise children of her own, or change her community. But Trinity mattered. Her life had value. The 2 years she lived were meaningful, even if they were cut short. In her family's memories, Trinity lives on as the little girl who loved Sesame Street and getting her hair done and playing at the park. She lives on in the photos her family took, the frozen moments of a happy toddler smiling for the camera. She lives on in the hearts of everyone who knew her and loved her. And in a broader sense, Trinity's story serves as a reminder of why we must protect children, why we must take child abuse seriously, why we must believe children when they tell us something is wrong, why we must be vigilant and attentive and willing to intervene when we suspect a child is in danger. Because children are vulnerable. They depend on adults for everything. They can't protect themselves. They can't escape bad situations. They trust that the grown-ups around them will keep them safe. And when that trust is betrayed, when adults fail to protect children or actively harm them, the consequences are devastating. Trinity's case made headlines in Georgia. It was covered by multiple news outlets, both at the time of her death and again when Kennedy was convicted and sentenced 3 years later. People read about what happened and felt horror, felt anger, felt grief for a child they never knew. That public attention matters. It keeps pressure on the justice system to take child abuse cases seriously. It reminds people that child abuse is real and happens in their communities. It encourages people to speak up when they suspect a child is being harmed. So perhaps that's part of Trinity's legacy too. Her story, tragic as it is, has reached thousands of people, and maybe some of those people will be more attentive to the children in their own lives. Maybe some of them will recognize warning signs they might have otherwise missed. Maybe some of them will have the courage to make a difficult phone call to report suspected abuse. If Trinity's death, awful as it was, ultimately helps protect even one other child from suffering a similar fate, then maybe that's something. It doesn't balance the scales, doesn't make what happened to Trinity okay, but it means her short life had an impact beyond the boundaries of her own existence. Even after Kennedy's conviction, even with the evidence presented at trial, even with his life sentence being served, there are questions about Trinity's case that may never be fully answered. Why did Kennedy hurt Trinity? Was it a moment of anger that spiraled out of control? Was it calculated cruelty? Had he hurt her before? Or was May 2nd, 2021 the first time? What was going through his mind as he slammed her head against that headboard? What was he thinking during those 2 hours while she lay unconscious? What made him pick her up and shake her when she woke up? And perhaps most haunting, what was he thinking while he played video games as Trinity died beside him? How did he compartmentalize what he'd done? How did he convince himself not to call for help? We may never know the answers to these questions. Kennedy didn't testify at his trial, which was his right. He hasn't given interviews explaining his actions. And even if he did, even if he tried to explain his thought process that day, would we be able to understand it? Can someone who would hurt a child and then watch her die truly explain their reasoning in a way that makes sense to people who would never do such a thing? Psychology offers some frameworks for understanding this kind of behavior. There's research on how stress and substance use can lower inhibitions and make people more likely to act violently. There's research on attachment disorders, on empathy deficits, on antisocial personality traits. There's research on how some people have difficulty regulating their emotions and can lash out when stressed or angry. But at the end of the day, millions of people experience stress. Millions of people use substances. Millions of people get frustrated with children's behavior. And they don't kill children. They don't slam toddlers' heads against furniture. They don't watch children die while playing video games. So while we can try to understand the psychological and social factors that might contribute to child abuse, we also have to acknowledge that some actions are, at their core, choices. Kennedy chose to hurt Trinity. He chose not to seek help for her. He chose himself, his comfort, his desire to drink and smoke and play games over the life of a 2-year-old girl. It's been more than 3 years now since Trinity Kyles died. The seasons have changed. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, and around again, multiple times. Life has gone on, as it always does, even after tragedy. Kennedy is in prison. He'll be there for the rest of his life. The criminal case is closed. Justice in the legal sense has been served. But for Trinity's family, the pain continues. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't resolve after a trial or a sentencing. It ebbs and flows, hitting hard on birthdays and holidays, on random Tuesdays, when something reminds you of the person you've lost. Rosie has to navigate life without her daughter. Trinity's extended family, her grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, have to find ways to remember her while also moving forward with their own lives. It's a difficult balance, honoring someone's memory while not being paralyzed by loss. There are probably days when the grief is overwhelming, when the unfairness of it all feels too heavy to bear. There are probably other days when life feels almost normal. And then the guilt comes because how dare life feel normal when Trinity is gone? This is what it means to survive after losing someone. Especially losing someone young. Especially losing someone to violence. You carry it with you, always. It becomes part of who you are. You learn to live with it, but you never get over it. Not really, you just learn how to keep going despite it. And for those of us who didn't know Trinity, who only learned about her story through news reports and court documents, we have our own role to play in moving forward. We can remember Trinity. We can share her story, not in an exploitative way, but as a reminder of why child protection matters. We can be more aware of the children in our own communities, more willing to notice when something seems wrong, more prepared to act when we suspect abuse. We can support organizations that work to prevent child abuse and help families in crisis. We can advocate for policies that protect children and hold abusers accountable. We can be part of creating a society where every child is safe, valued, and protected. These might seem like small things in the face of such a terrible loss. But collectively, these small actions matter. They create a culture that prioritizes child welfare. They make it harder for abusers to harm children and easier for people to intervene when they suspect abuse. The murder of Trinity Kyles is a story without a happy ending. There's no justice that can truly make this right. No sentence that can bring Trinity back. No explanation that can make sense of why someone would hurt a child and then let her die. But it's a story that needed to be told. Because Trinity's life mattered. Because every child's life matters. Because we owe it to the children who can't protect themselves to be vigilant, to be aware, to be willing to act when we suspect they're in danger. Trinity Maria Kyles was born in 2019. She died on May 2nd, 2021. She was 2 years old. She loved Sesame Street. She loved getting her hair done. She loved playing at the park. She loved taking photos with her family. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to turn 3 and 4 and 5 and 20 and 40. She deserved to experience all the joys and sorrows and ordinary moments that make up a human life. She didn't get any of that, because on one May afternoon, the person trusted to care for her made different choices. But we can choose differently. We can choose to protect children. We can choose to speak up. We can choose to act. We can choose to remember Trinity and to honor her memory by working to ensure that other children don't suffer the same fate. That's not much. But it's something. And sometimes something is all we have. Rest in peace, Trinity. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet university town of Davis, California, where tree-lined streets and bicycle paths create an atmosphere of safety and community, the morning of April 14, 2013 would shatter that peace forever. What police discovered in a modest condominium that spring morning would become one of the most disturbing cases in the town's history. This is the story of Daniel Marsh, a case that challenges our understanding of evil, youth, and the human capacity for violence. As you settle in for the night, I'll take you through this complex and unsettling true crime story. Oliver Northup Jr., known to everyone as Chip, was 87 years old, a lawyer and accomplished musician. He'd lived a full life marked by service and family. His wife, Claudia Mopine, was 76, a pastoral associate at the Davis Unitarian Church, and an active participant in local theater. The couple had found each other later in life, meeting at the Unitarian Universalist Church where they both worshipped. They married in 1996, blending their families into something beautiful. Between them, they had 11 children from previous marriages, 14 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. Their home on South Davis was filled with the warmth of a life well lived, photographs on the walls, books on the shelves, the accumulated treasures of decades. That Sunday evening, April 13th, they went to bed like any other night, unaware that someone was watching, waiting, hunting. Just 2 doors down from Chip and Claudia's home lived a man named Bill Marsh with his 15-year-old son, Daniel. And on that April night, while Davis slept peacefully, Daniel Marsh was preparing for murder. He'd been planning this for years. Not this specific act against these specific people, but the act itself, the taking of life, the feeling of ultimate power. Daniel had spent years fantasizing about torture, about killing, about becoming a serial killer. And on this night, as he would later confess, he'd simply had enough of waiting. His preparation was meticulous, calculated beyond his years. He taped the bottoms of his shoes so he wouldn't leave footprints. He wore gloves to avoid fingerprints. He dressed entirely in black, complete with a black face mask, and he armed himself with a 6-inch buck knife, taken from his mother's hunting collection. Between 2 and 3 in the morning, Daniel left his mother's house and began roaming the streets of Davis. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular. He was looking for opportunity, an open window, an unlocked door, a way in. He checked between 40 and 50 homes that night, testing windows, trying doors, searching for vulnerability in the sleeping town. And then he found it. A window at a condominium, just 2 doors down from his father's house, the home of Chip Northup and Claudia Mopine. Daniel cut through the window screen with his knife. The sound was quiet in the night air. He climbed through and found himself in the living room of strangers. And there, in that dark house, he waited. He listened, until he heard what he was waiting for. The sound of snoring from the master bedroom. What happened next was so brutal, so savage, that even seasoned homicide detectives would struggle to process the scene. Daniel entered the bedroom where Chip and Claudia lay sleeping. He attacked them with his knife, stabbing again and again. Chip Northup suffered 61 stab wounds. Claudia Mopine suffered 67. 128 times the knife plunged into elderly flesh. But the horror didn't end with their deaths. Daniel proceeded to dissect their bodies, to eviscerate them, to mutilate them in ways that demonstrated what the judge would later call exceptional depravity. He placed items from their nightstand inside their bodies, staging the scene for police to discover. And then, his mission accomplished, Daniel Marsh slipped back out into the night, leaving behind no DNA, no fingerprints, no footprints, just the destroyed bodies of 2 innocent people who'd had the misfortune of leaving a window unlocked. The next day, family members discovered the bodies. The coroner's office arrived. Body bags were carried out of the home, while neighbors watched in horror. Davis, a town where people rarely locked their doors, would never feel quite as safe again. For 2 months, the case went cold. Despite the obvious violence of the crime, there was no physical evidence, no witnesses, no leads. The killer had been exceptionally careful, but Daniel Marsh had made one critical mistake. He couldn't keep quiet about what he'd done. He began bragging to his friends, telling them details, describing the murders, and eventually one of those friends made a decision that would change everything. In June of 2013, 17-year-old Alvaro Garibay called the police. He wanted to remain anonymous because, as he told them, if his mother found out he'd made the call, she'd send him to military school. But what he had to say was too important to keep silent. His best friend, he said, had killed that couple in April. His best friend, Daniel Marsh. The name was familiar to the Yolo County District Attorney, Jeff Riesig, but not in connection with crime. Daniel Marsh had once been considered a young hero. At age 10, he'd used CPR to save his father's life when Bill Marsh had a heart attack while driving. Daniel had steered the car to safety and performed CPR until help arrived, earning him an American Red Cross Heroes Award. The district attorney remembered thinking at the time that this kid was going places. He never imagined those places would include a murder investigation. On June 17, 2013, police brought Daniel in for questioning. The high school resource officer delivered him to the station, and Daniel seemed more than happy to talk. He probably thought he could talk his way through it. He was intelligent, articulate, and he'd been so careful at the crime scene. For 3 hours, detectives learned everything they could about Daniel Marsh. They heard about his troubled childhood, his parents' contentious divorce, his feelings of isolation, and eventually they got what they were looking for. Daniel confessed to everything. In his confession, Daniel described the murders in detail. He explained how he'd planned them, how he'd searched for an open house, how he'd waited in the darkness listening to his victims sleep. He described the attacks themselves, the feeling of the knife in his hand, the sight of blood. And then he said something that would chill everyone who heard it. The murders had given him a feeling of pure happiness that lingered for weeks. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't an impulsive act by a troubled teen. This was a carefully planned execution of a fantasy that Daniel had been cultivating for years. He'd wanted to kill. He'd wanted to know what it felt like. And when asked, he expressed no remorse, only satisfaction. Daniel William Marsh was born in May of 1997. His early years were marked by family dysfunction. His parents, Sherry Hosking and Bill Marsh, had a troubled marriage from the start. Bill Marsh had an explosive temper, quick to scream and yell. The household was tense, and young Daniel and his sister Sarah learned to be quiet around their father, visibly tensing when he was near. When Daniel was around 7, his parents separated and eventually divorced. It was a contentious split involving a custody battle and bitter feelings on both sides. Sherry Hosking began a relationship with the children's kindergarten teacher, a woman. Daniel was furious about this, avoiding his mother's partner and showing recurring patterns of angry outbursts after visits with his father. He began showing signs of mental health struggles early. By age 11, he was diagnosed with major depression following a series of traumatic events. The most significant was at age 12 when his father had a massive heart attack while driving with Daniel in the car. Daniel steered the car to safety and performed CPR, saving his father's life. The heroic act earned him accolades and an award from the American Red Cross. But the trauma of seeing his father nearly die, of feeling responsible for keeping him alive, marked a turning point. As his mother later testified, it was as if his childhood ended that day. His innocence was gone. The ensuing media attention only made it worse, constantly bringing him back to that traumatic moment. As Daniel entered his teenage years, things deteriorated further. He began using marijuana and alcohol. He developed anorexia and was hospitalized for treatment. He was bullied at Davis High School. His grades slipped and he began skipping classes. A close family friend who'd served as a mentor to him died suddenly, leaving Daniel even more isolated. And beneath it all, growing like a cancer, were the violent fantasies. By January of 2013, just months before the murders, Daniel was seeing both a child psychiatrist and a private therapist through Kaiser Permanente. As part of his treatment for severe depression, he was on powerful medications to treat his depression, anger, and anxiety. But he was also telling people about his violent thoughts. At Davis High School, where he received mental health services as part of his individualized education program, Daniel spoke openly about his ideations. He told counselor Monica O'Brien that he had daily suicidal thoughts, and then he told her something worse. He had homicidal thoughts about his school peers. When O'Brien asked if he would act on these thoughts, Daniel's response was chilling. "I have full confidence that I could hurt these people. The school psychologist, Dr. Jordan Mulder, also heard Daniel's disturbing statements. Daniel told him that given the situation, he would hurt other people. Specifically, he talked about students he perceived as superior, students who thought they were better than others, and he said he had no problem hurting them. In his mind, it would be fair and just. Daniel also expressed beliefs about overpopulation, saying it was okay to reduce the number of people in the world, but not by natural means. He was talking about killing. In December of 2012, just 4 months before the murders, Daniel had an explosive incident on the Davis High School campus that led to a psychiatric evaluation. During that evaluation, he admitted he'd made several suicide attempts in the past year. He was placed on a psychiatric hold and spent a week in a Sacramento mental health facility. Yet despite all these red flags, despite the explicit statements about wanting to hurt people, Daniel slipped through the cracks. His parents, dealing with their own issues, didn't keep him consistently in therapy. He continued to have access to violent content online, what was later described as gore porn. He had a girlfriend with whom he engaged in violent sexual acts, including choking. The warning signs were everywhere, and no one put all the pieces together in time. In September of 2014, Daniel Marsh, now 17 years old, went on trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. He was tried as an adult. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that his mental illness and the side effects of his medications had triggered uncontrollable violence. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The prosecution presented Daniel's confession, the evidence of his meticulous planning and testimony about his stated desire to become a serial killer. They brought in witnesses who testified about his violent thoughts and his lack of remorse. The defense presented testimony about Daniel's troubled childhood, his mental health struggles, and the failures of the system to adequately treat him. They brought in psychiatrists who treated Daniel, including Dr. Matthew Soulier, whom Daniel had once threatened to kill during an examination. Even Soulier, who found Daniel to be mentally ill, concluded that he was legally sane at the time of the murders. Daniel's mother, Sherry Hosking, took the stand. Overcome with emotion, she testified about her troubled marriage, the contentious divorce, and her son's deteriorating mental health. She spoke about the knife police had recovered, a buck knife that had been a gift reminiscent of her outdoorsy childhood. She'd kept it in her nightstand drawer, but couldn't remember when or how it had gone missing. She told the court about visiting Daniel in juvenile hall, about the one time he'd mentioned the murders, the day of his arrest, when he called her from the police station and simply said, "I killed those people." I believe he was capable of angry violence. She testified, but nothing like that. He was the young man who opened the door for elders. I can't conceive of the Daniel I know being involved in any of that. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard Daniel's confession played aloud. They heard him describe the murders, and the pure happiness they'd given him. They heard about his fantasy of becoming a serial killer, his careful planning, his complete lack of remorse. On September 24th, 2014, the jury found Daniel William Marsh guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They found him legally sane at the time of the offenses. Judge David Reed sentenced him to 52 years to life in prison. Due to Daniel's age at the time of the crimes, he would be eligible for parole at age 41. For Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin's families, it was some measure of justice, though nothing could bring back their loved ones or erase the horror of what had been done to them. But the story didn't end there. In the years following Daniel's conviction, California's laws regarding juvenile offenders began to change dramatically, and Daniel Marsh's case found itself at the center of a heated legal and political debate. In November of 2016, California voters passed Proposition 57, which changed how juveniles could be prosecuted. Prior to Prop 57, prosecutors could directly file cases against juveniles in adult court for certain violent crimes. The new law required judges, not prosecutors, to make that determination through what's called a transfer hearing. Because Daniel had been directly filed in adult court under the old law, Prop 57 entitled him to a retroactive transfer hearing. The 3rd District Court of Appeal conditionally reversed his conviction and ordered his case back to Yolo County Juvenile Court for a judge to determine whether he should have been tried as a juvenile or an adult. If the judge found he should have been tried in juvenile court, Daniel could only be detained until he reached the age of 25. If the judge upheld the adult court decision, his original conviction and sentence would stand. The transfer hearing took place in October of 2018. Daniel, now 21 years old, took the witness stand for the first time. He offered an apology to the families of his victims. He claimed he was a changed man, that he'd undergone therapy and counseling in prison, that he'd learned about love and compassion. "I was a really damaged, sick, screwed up kid," Daniel testified, "so I don't blame anybody for seeing me through that lens." He described childhood traumas, including physical and sexual abuse, negligent parents, and suicidal and homicidal urges that weren't properly treated. He claimed that individual therapy and group counseling programs in prison had changed his life and the way he saw the world. But Yolo County prosecutors weren't convinced. They argued that Daniel was highly calculated in planning his crime, that he'd stated it gave him an exhilarating feeling, and that he told investigators he'd enjoyed the killings. They pointed out that during a psychological evaluation for psychopathy, Daniel had scored 35.8 out of a possible 40 points, the highest score the examiner had ever seen. Even more disturbing, while incarcerated, Daniel had gotten tattoos depicting his mother's wounds from the crime scene on his own body. Judge Samuel McAdam presided over the 8-day hearing and carefully considered all the testimony. In his ruling, delivered on October 24, 2018, he agreed with the prosecution. Daniel Marsh would remain in adult court to serve his original sentence. In his ruling, McAdam acknowledged that Daniel likely did experience a traumatic childhood and severe mental illness, but he noted that Daniel has made no real effort at family therapy or understanding what really caused his trauma. McAdam pointed out that Daniel had only started utilizing mental health services in prison during the previous 6 months, and those sessions had been focused on adjusting to life behind bars, not addressing the trauma that led to the murders. The court's concern here is that these traumas are triggers. McAdam said he does well in a controlled setting, but what happens when he is not in a controlled setting? Most significantly, McAdam stated that given the nature of Daniel's crimes and his limited progress, there was virtually no chance that Marsh will be rehabilitated before he turns 25 years old. The families of Chit and Claudia breathed a sigh of relief. Justice, they felt, had been served once again. But still the story continued. In 2018, California Governor Jerry Brown signed Senate Bill 1391 into law. This new legislation prohibited the prosecution of juveniles under the age of 16 as adults, regardless of the severity of their crimes. Daniel Marsh was 15 when he committed the murders, just 2 months shy of his 16th birthday. His attorneys argued that SB 1391 should apply retroactively to his case. Under this law, if Daniel were transferred to the juvenile justice system, he could potentially be released when he turned 25. His 25th birthday would be May 14, 2022. He would be released unsupervised, without parole, and his record would be sealed. The victims' families were horrified. Victoria Hurd, Claudia's daughter, spoke publicly about her fears. She described how she'd watched as the coroner's office carried body bags containing her mother and stepfather out of their home. She spoke about enduring a 5-week murder trial in 2014, and how now, years later, they had to relive the nightmare again. "This is not a juvenile who needs a second chance," she said. "This is a man who thought about what he was doing and has been quoted as saying he would do it again." The family launched a campaign to prevent Daniel's release. Over 300 Davis residents sent letters to the court opposing his transfer to juvenile court. The Davis community, still traumatized by the murders, rallied behind the families. The legal battle wound its way through the California court system. Various district attorneys, including Santa Clara's Jeff Rosen, filed appeals arguing that SB 1391 violated the California Constitution and was inconsistent with Prop 57. For the families, each hearing, each appeal, each legal proceeding meant reliving the worst day of their lives. As Victoria Hurd noted, this was their 3rd time dealing with the legal system regarding someone who had heinously murdered their parents. In August of 2021, Daniel Marsh had an appeal hearing regarding SB 1391. He could potentially be released as early as May 2022, when he turned 25. The family spent weeks in anguish waiting for the decision. On September 8, 2021, the California Court of Appeals dismissed Daniel Marsh's appeal. The court ruled that his judgment was final before SB 1391 went into effect, and therefore the new law didn't apply to his case. Daniel Marsh would remain in prison, continuing to serve his sentence of 52 years to life. He would not be released at 25. He would remain behind bars, eligible for parole only when he reached age 41, in the year 2038. For the families of Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin, it was finally perhaps the end of the legal battles. They could begin to truly process their grief without the constant threat of their loved one's killer being released back into their community. The case of Daniel Marsh raises profound questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil. Can someone who commits such horrific acts at 15 be rehabilitated? Should they be? At what point does the severity of a crime override considerations of the perpetrator's age? These aren't easy questions, and different people will have different answers. The families of the victims are clear in their position. Daniel Marsh is dangerous and should never be released. The evidence presented at trial supports their view. His careful planning, his stated desire to become a serial killer, his complete lack of remorse, and his psychopathy score all paint a picture of someone fundamentally different from most troubled teenagers. Yet Daniel's story also highlights the failures of the mental health system and the dangers of untreated mental illness in young people. Here was a teenager who explicitly told multiple professionals that he had homicidal thoughts, that he wanted to hurt people, that he believed it would be fair and just to do so. And despite these clear warning signs, he wasn't stopped. His parents, dealing with their own troubled relationship and eventual divorce, didn't maintain consistent mental health treatment for their son. The school system, despite being aware of his violent ideations, didn't have the authority or resources to intervene more aggressively. The mental health professionals who treated him didn't have the full picture of just how dangerous he was becoming. By the time Daniel Marsh slipped through that window screen in the early morning hours of April 14, 2013, it was already too late. 2 innocent people were about to lose their lives in the most brutal way imaginable. 11 children would lose their parents. 14 grandchildren would lose their grandparents. 8 great-grandchildren would grow up knowing their great-grandparents were murdered. And a 15-year-old boy would transform himself into the very thing he'd fantasized about becoming, a killer. Today, Daniel Marsh remains incarcerated at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. He's now in his late 20s, serving his sentence of 52 years to life. He will be eligible for parole when he's 41 years old, though there's no guarantee he'll be granted parole at that time. The families of Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin continue to live with the trauma of what happened. They've had to fight multiple legal battles to ensure justice was served and their loved one's killer remained behind bars. They've become advocates for victims' rights and for ensuring that the severity of crimes is considered in juvenile sentencing decisions. The town of Davis has slowly healed, though the scars remain. People lock their windows now. They're more cautious. The innocence of that college town, where bicycles outnumber cars and people trusted their neighbors implicitly, has been forever changed. And somewhere in the California prison system, Daniel Marsh sits in his cell, a young man who will spend the majority of his life behind bars for acts he committed when he was just 15 years old. Whether he's truly changed, whether he's capable of remorse, whether he could ever safely be released into society, these are questions that won't be answered for many years to come. The case of Daniel Marsh reminds us that evil can wear an ordinary face. It can be the neighbor boy who saved his father's life. It can be the quiet teenager who walks to school each morning. And sometimes, despite all the warning signs, despite all the cries for help, evil slips through the cracks until it's too late. For Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin, 2 people who dedicated their lives to their community, their faith, and their family, the ending came far too soon, and in a way that no one should have to experience. Their story serves as a reminder to treasure our loved ones, to lock our windows, and to pay attention when troubled young people tell us they're having violent thoughts. Because sometimes, those thoughts aren't just fantasies. Sometimes they're plans. And sometimes those plans become reality in the darkest hours of the night when a quiet college town is sleeping peacefully, unaware that murder is walking its streets. Rest in peace, Oliver Northup and Claudia Maupin. Your lives mattered. Your deaths mattered. And your story, as difficult as it is to tell and to hear, matters too. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.